In the long arc of epistemology, the Get to Know What Knowledge Is project has often run through the idea that knowing something is a trusty combination. Your belief is true, you have good reasons for thinking it, and those reasons are reliable in the right way. For centuries, that basic recipe was crystallized in the traditional JTB formula, justified true belief. If you believed something, it happened to be true, and your belief was supported by justification that you could, in principle, spell out and defend, then you knew it. Plato's dialogues already stage a tension between belief and knowledge, a tension that the Meno brings into sharp relief when Socrates pushes the question, can you ever truly know something you cannot justify in a way that others can understand? The famous line that is often cited, though in various translations, frames the core ambition of epistemology, knowledge as true belief with an account. In Plato's setting, knowledge is not merely a lucky hunch dressed up as conviction. It is anchored by reasons, by arguments, by a rational rendering that can be given to others. And because this is philosophy, the concern is not just about whether someone happens to be right, but about why their rightness would be robust if the surrounding conditions shifted, if the wind changed, or if a new objection appeared. Turn forward a couple of millennia, and Descartes becomes the emblem of the quest for certainty. In the Meditations, he famously presses a hyper-skeptical doubt to squeeze out indubitable ground. If I can doubt everything, my senses, the external world, even the reliability of my own reasoning, what remains? The answer he reaches is the indubitable proposition, I think, therefore I am. The move is not merely about belief being true. It is about belief secured by a kind of internal, non-deceptive form of justification that you cannot readily doubt. The path to knowledge, on Descartes' early picture, travels through the careful alignment of thinking with being, a search for an anchor so firm that even radical doubt cannot loosen it. In that culture of reflection, knowledge is a crown worn only by those whose justifications are so tight that a skeptical challenge would collapse them. But then, in 1963, a paper arrives that shakes the whole house. Is justified true belief knowledge? Its author, known to analytic philosophers of the time for careful argument, offered a simple yet devastating challenge to the long-held assumption that justification plus truth plus belief sufficed for knowledge. The Gettier problem, as it has come to be called, asks us to imagine cases in which a person has a belief that is justified and true, yet intuitively does not count as knowledge. And this is where the story about origins and core ideas really begins to unfold. The Gettier move, at its heart, is a critique of the core assumption that justification guarantees truth in the right way to yield knowledge. It asks, can a belief be formed through justification that looks good on paper, be true by luck, and yet fail to be knowledge because the truth did not come about in the way the justification would require? The structure is precise. A person has a belief P, their justification J supports P ends up being true, but the justification J would not guarantee the truth of P in the relevantly similar possible world. Or to put it plainly, belief plus justification plus luck leading to truth, this combination, Gettier argues, can produce a true belief that does not meet the standard of knowledge. To understand this better, let us walk through the classic Gettier form in a careful, step-by-step way, before moving on to a second Gettier-style story in a different domain, and then to the broader landscape of responses and revisions that followed. First, the classic Smith/Jones case. Imagine two people, Smith and Jones, applying for the same job. Smith has a robust reason to think that Jones will get the job. Their potential employer has told Smith that Jones will be chosen, and to make the matter even more compelling, Smith knows that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. From those two bits of justification, Jones will get the job and Jones has 10 coins, Smith forms a belief with the very simple content. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. He therefore comes to hold the belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now the twist. What if the actual truth of the matter turns out differently? It transpires that Smith will, in fact, get the job, not Jones. And what if, in addition, Smith himself has 10 coins in his pocket? Then the proposition, the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, is true, but crucially its truth is not secured by Smith's justification. The justification concerns Jones and his 10 coins, not Smith and his own situation. The man who will get the job is Smith, and indeed Smith has 10 coins, so the proposition happens to be true for reasons unrelated to Smith's justification. The belief remains justified and true, but the truth of the proposition is merely lucky with respect to Smith's basis for the belief. The acceleration of the thought is precise. Smith did not know the proposition. His justification did not connect reliably to the actual truth of which man will get the job. The truth of the proposition happened to align with Smith's belief and justification by luck, not by a causal or reliable connection that would secure knowledge. To walk through it step by step, as the original paper encourages. You notice that Smith has justification for believing that Jones will get the job. He also sees that Jones has 10 coins, which supports the further belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Therefore, Smith forms the belief the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. The belief is true. But the reason for the truth is not that Jones will get the job and has 10 coins, which would be the expected chain of justification. It is instead that Smith himself will get the job and in a separate turn of fortune also happens to have 10 coins. The link between the justification and the truth is a chain that would, in ordinary circumstances, make a reliable connection to the truth, but in this case the truth's occurrence is independent of that chain. The result is a justified true belief that fails to rise to knowledge because the justification would not, in an analogous possible world, secure the truth. Gettier's point is not that all justified beliefs are bad candidates for knowledge. Rather, the point is that even when justification is present and the proposition is true, that conjunction does not necessarily amount to knowledge. There is a crucial kind of luck at work. The truth occurs to be the case in the actual world, but not in a way guaranteed by the agent's justification. In other words, the Gettier case exposes a gap in the traditional analysis. There can be justified true beliefs that are not knowledge because the path from justification to truth happens to be blocked by an element of luck or an extraneous factor that does not bear on the truth-tracking nature of the belief. Now to our second Gettier-style story in a different domain. Let us shift from the job market and 10 coins to the world of science and perception, a domain many find intuitive and compelling for illustrating how Gettier cases work when the connection is less about social luck and more about empirical or perceptual luck. Suppose a scientist is studying a particular chemical reaction. The scientist has justified belief that a certain product P is formed when reactant A and reactant B come together under controlled laboratory conditions. The justification rests on two reliable sources: a well-evidenced theoretical model, and a successful set of prior experiments with a closely related reaction. Based on those sources, the scientist believes with justification that product P will be produced in this reaction. And suppose further that the experimental setup is such that, in this particular trial, the apparatus happens to produce P indeed, for reasons that are not accounted for by the theoretical model. It turns out that a completely different path, a lucky parallel process in the apparatus, produced the same product P, making the belief true by luck rather than by the mechanism the justification was designed to track. In this second case, the scientist is justified in believing that product P will be produced, and the trial yields P, so the belief is true. Yet the core justification, based on the theoretical model and the related experiments, did not guarantee P was produced by the specific mechanism in this trial. The truth of the proposition is secured by a contingent accident in the laboratory, an accident that did not flow from the theoretical justification or from the intended causal connection. This is Gettier-style reasoning in a scientific setting. Justification remains credible, the outcome turns out to be true, but the route from justification to truth is not the robust, explanatory route we require for knowledge. This second case mirrors the structure in a domain many people find vivid. The belief is supported by justification. The fact is that the belief turns out to be true. But the truth is not yielded by a reliable connection between justification and the actual truth. In both cases, what matters is the presence of luck in the truth's location, not a secure link from justification to truth. We should pause to emphasize an important distinction. Gettier cases are not merely about lucky guesses. An ordinary lucky guess would be a belief formed without justification or with poor justification that nonetheless happens to be true by chance. The Gettier cases insist on the contrary. The agent has substantial justification for the belief is true, and yet this truth arises not through the justification's reliable connection to the truth, but through a separate, often coincidental factor. In ordinary luck, you're wrong about how you got it right or you had no justification at all. In Gettier scenarios, you have a strong justification that would ordinarily support the truth, but the actual truth track is a different, luck-driven track. That distinction matters because it motivates the search for theories of knowledge that can refine the JTB analysis by adding conditions that rule out these luck-based successes. Part of the fascination with the Gettier problem lies in how it reframes the debate that followed. It does not simply demand a more stringent account of what justification should be. It invites a broader investigation into what the bridge between justification and truth must look like if we want the bridge to be secure in nearby possible worlds. This bracing shift in emphasis, from a monotone ladder of certainty to a more careful analysis of how justification connects to truth in practice, has structured much of the discussion in epistemology since the 1960s and 70s. To understand the historical context, it helps to turn to the publication moment itself. Gettier's paper Is Justified True Belief Knowledge appeared in the early 1960s, a period when analytic philosophy was intensely occupied with clarifying knowledge, belief, justification, truth, and skepticism. The paper arrived into a milieu that already admired precision and rigorous argumentation, but its central claim, namely that justified true belief does not necessarily yield knowledge, released a torrent of responses. The reaction was not a monolith. Some greeted the result with exuberant appreciation, a clean, elegant set of counterexamples that forced a rethinking of long-standing dogmas. Others raised objections, pointing to potential weaknesses in the cases or arguing that the analysis could be salvaged by adding a further condition or two. Still others suggested that the Gettier move was a provocation to broaden the epistemological toolkit, to consider alternative theories of knowledge rather than to defend the old structure by exhaustive repairs. In the 1960s and 1970s, the immediate aftermath featured a flurry of journal responses. Philosophers debated in the pages of major journals about whether the Gettier cases were genuinely compelling, whether they could be generalized, and what their implications would be for internalist and externalist accounts of justification. The conversation turned toward a deeper issue. If knowledge is not simply justified true belief, then what is the mechanism by which justification supports knowledge? The debate moved from a concern with certainty, Plato's legacy and Descartes' pursuit of certainty, to a concern with the mechanics of justification. How does justification reliably track truth in the actual world and across nearby possible worlds? Two historical anecdotes help illuminate the mood and stakes of this moment, even as we stitch together a broader narrative of reception. The first anecdote concerns the early reception among contemporaries who publicly weighed in on Gettier's challenge. Some celebrated the paper as a brilliantly crafted puzzle that would force epistemology to confront a stubborn inconsistency between what we are justified in believing and what we can truly know. They framed the Gettier counterexamples as a clarion call to re-examine the bridge from belief to knowledge and to demand a theory that can track truth more reliably. Others were more cautious, raising concerns that the Gettier cases might be artificially constructed or contrived to reflect ordinary knowledge attributions. They warned against drawing sweeping conclusions about knowledge from cases that rely on carefully assembled coincidences or abstract structures rather than intuitive, everyday knowledge practices. The back and forth in journals, Mead-like exchanges across philosophy, mind, analysis, and the Journal of Philosophy, became a hallmark of how analytic epistemology began to evolve in real time. A second anecdote concerns the broader shift in epistemology that Gettier helped catalyze. The 1960s and 70s saw a proliferation of new theories designed to plug the gaps exposed by Gettier. The reliabilist response, most prominently associated with Alvin Goldman, proposed that knowledge could be identified with robust reliability of the cognitive process in the appropriate conditions. The idea was to look beyond justification as a mere defense of belief and toward the reliability of the mental processes that generate belief in response to the world. The causal theories, as pushed by thinkers like Fred Dretske and Richard Byon in various forms, suggested that a proper explanation of knowledge requires a causal link between the belief and the fact. The safety and proper function approaches, pushing further into a normative dimension, emerged as attempts to capture what must hold for a belief to count as knowledge regardless of superficial justification. And eventually the contextualist turn, jointly associated with philosophers like Keith Der Rose in the 1990s, began to argue that the hardness or softness of the knowledge claim could shift with the conversational context, even when the same states of mind appear to be the same. These are not afterthoughts, they are responses that trace their energy to Gettier's challenge: how to secure knowledge in a world where luck can yield truths that seem to follow from justified belief, even if the justification does not guarantee truth in the relevant sense. Cross-references to other thinkers and ideas abound in this story, because the Gettier problem sits at an intersection of several strands of philosophical inquiry. One line of connection runs to Plato's theory of knowledge in the Meno, where the aim is to capture knowledge as a true belief supported by an account. The Gettier problem shows that just having a true belief with an account is not, by itself, enough to ensure knowledge. The account must do more than explain why the belief is true in the current context. In effect, Gettier invites a more robust account of the why that links belief to truth in a way that would withstand the kinds of near mistakes the scenarios reveal. A second line of connection runs to Descartes, whose pursuit of certainty and methodic doubt presupposes that justification must be secure, not merely plausible. The Gettier problem is a counterpoint to the Cartesian ideal. Even when we feel confident that we have justification, the possibility remains that the truth will be a matter of luck rather than a deep connection to the truth itself. In that sense, the Gettier problem resonates with the Cartesian worry that certainty is not guaranteed by cognitive processes alone, and that any robust account of knowledge must consider how justification survives skeptical challenges or contingent luck. A third line of connection traces the internalism/externalism debate. Gettier's examples foreground a crucial question. To what extent is justification a purely internal matter, that is, a matter of what you can access in your own mental life? And to what extent does it depend on factors in the external world, such as reliability, causal connections to truth, or the environmental conditions in which beliefs are formed? The later literature has seen externalist theories contend that a belief can be justified in ways that are not fully accessible to the subject, provided that the external aspects of the belief's formation reliably track truth. The reliabilist path embodies this move, while other paths, even within internalist thinking, strive to specify what counts as a robust, truth-tracking justification that cannot be undermined by Gettier-like luck. As the discussion progressed, several broad strategies began to appear to address Gettier-style challenges. The first and most straightforward is to strengthen the JTB analysis with additional conditions that rule out cases where luck plays a role. You might require, for instance, a no-fake lemmas constraint or a tracking requirement. If your belief is justified, then in nearby possible worlds where the proposition is false, you would not hold the belief. This approach aims to ensure that the justification would not allow the belief to survive even a small counterfactual shift in the truth value. The second track is to shift the emphasis away from justification as a static property and toward a dynamic account of knowledge that emphasizes the reliability of cognitive processes. Reliabilism asks what kind of cognitive processes were responsible for the belief and whether those processes are truth-conducive in the long run. If they are, the belief can count as knowledge. The third track introduces causal accounts. Knowledge consists in a robust causal connection between belief and truth. If your belief is caused by the actual fact and that causal connection would hold across similar worlds, then your belief can be counted as knowledge. The fourth track emphasizes safety, a concept associated with the sense that if the belief were false, the subject would not hold it in similar nearby situations. Suffice to say, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Many contemporary theories blend elements, reliability, safety, proper functional processes, and even contextual considerations, to carve out a robust conception of knowledge that can absorb Gettier-like cases. There are also practical considerations and real-world implications. The Gettier problem is not a purely abstract puzzle. It has resonance for how we think about justification in real situations, how scientists justify their theories, how juries or editors evaluate claims in moral and political discourse, and how we evaluate the credibility of information in a digital age saturated with data, misinformation, and disinformation. In practical terms, Gettier encourages epistemologists to ask, when does the justification truly secure truth, and in what sense can we say we know something when we are aware that truth might be achieved by luck in certain exposed scenarios? Let us also consider some analogies to illuminate the intuition. Think of knowledge as a bridge built from a careful roadbed of justification. In ordinary travel, the bridge must withstand ordinary weather and the occasional gust. A Gettier case shows a bridge that seems to be well constructed, with sturdy rails and clear signs, but whose deck sags or whose anchor points rely on a hidden, coincidental alignment with the ground truth. The bridge remains usable for certain journeys, and it may safely take you across most days, yet on a particular route it fails to connect you to the truth in a robust way. The Gettier problem invites us to reimagine the bridge by adding safeguards, deeper foundations tied to the actual truth tracking of the underlying grounds, a reliable mechanism by which the justification would withstand counterfactual shifts, and an architecture that ensures the bridge would not collapse under nearby, plausible conditions where the truth would fail. Across these lines of thought, the Gettier problem has become a conduit for broader philosophical exploration. It has opened the door to a family of responses that have grown more sophisticated over the decades, from reliabilist accounts that privilege truth-conducive cognitive processes, to causal theories that insist on a direct connection between belief and truth, to safety-based approaches that demand that the belief would not readily be false in nearby possible worlds, to contextualist approaches that adjust knowledge claims according to conversational context. The story is a story of a field becoming more precise about what it would take to count as knowledge in ordinary life, not merely in idealized demonstrations. As we near a close on this grounding section, it helps to see how the Gettier problem has shaped modern epistemology, not only in the abstract, but also in the way philosophers talk about knowledge in the lab and in daily life. The Gettier challenge has changed how we think about what it means to know, moving the conversation away from mere certainty toward an analysis of justification and truth that respects the contingencies of the actual world. It has also nudged us to connect epistemology with adjacent debates. How do we understand justification when we consider the difference between what is accessible to us, internalism, and what lies in the world that justifies belief, externalism? How do we interpret justification when it must be robust across possible worlds, not merely in the actual world? And how do we evaluate knowledge claims in the information-rich, quickly evolving epistemic environment of today? In the wake of Gettier's landmark challenge, philosophers began to realize that the old sense of certainty, an all-or-nothing condition tied to a direct, unmediated justification, might be too simple to capture how we really know things. The problem was not merely technical. It was a philosophical invitation to re-examine deeper questions about truth, justification, and the conditions under which human belief connects with reality. The Gettier problem pulled the rug out from under the comfortable assumption that justification is enough, and then it offered a long, winding road, full of proposals, refinements, and debates that would carry epistemology to more nuanced terrain. To sum up, the core idea behind Gettier's challenge is straightforward in its clarity and devastating in its implications. A belief can be justified, true, and believed, yet not count as knowledge if the truth of the belief depends on luck rather than a reliable connection between justification and truth. The classic Smith/Jones case gives a crisp demonstration of this structure. The second Gettier-style case, set in science or everyday perception, shows that the same pattern can arise in domains beyond social reasoning. The difference between Gettier cases and ordinary lucky guesses helps to sharpen the point. Gettier cases combine robust justification with luck in truth, not merely a fluke of chance, and this is the tension that spurred the birth of new theories about knowledge. Looking ahead, the Gettier problem sets the stage for a set of defenses and alternatives. The subsequent literature would see proposals to complicate the JTB analysis, adding conditions to rule out luck or reframing justification in terms of reliability, causation, or safety. It would also open doors to externalist and contextualist accounts, which argue that knowledge depends on factors beyond the subject's interior mental life. The dialogue continues to this day, with debates about how best to reconcile the intuitive sense of having knowledge with the increasingly precise, often technical, criteria for what makes that knowledge robust and reliable. In the end, what Gettier makes us confront is not simply a puzzle to be solved, but a deeper question about how humans come to know anything at all in a world full of contingent luck, misleading cues, and complex causal webs. The Gettier problem invites us to keep asking, what is the right bridge between our justified beliefs and the truth we seek to inhabit, and how can we fortify that bridge so that it does not fail us when luck appears at the doorway? Let us step into the room where knowledge begins to take shape, not as a tidy formula, but as a living structure we can walk around, inspect from different angles, and sometimes discover cracks in. The topic today is the structure of a knowledge claim, JTB and the Gettier twist. It is a journey through the architecture of belief, what counts as evidence, what justification really is, and why a certain kind of luck, epistemic luck, can distort even our clearest intuitions about knowing. We will trace origins, examine key thinkers, lay out the main arguments, test them with at least 2 Gettier-style examples from perception, memory, and inference, offer counterarguments that aim to shore up knowledge claims against luck, explore real-world implications, and consider how modern interpretations recast what we mean by justification, reliability, safety, and closure. We'll wander through historical anecdotes that illuminate the long-running debate between internalist and externalist intuitions about justification, and we'll make explicit cross-references to foundational discussions in epistemology, to later developments like reliabilism and safety notions, and to familiar terms such as closure and epistemic luck. I'll try to keep the pace calm and the tone reflective, as if we were walking through a gallery of ideas, pausing to study each painting up close and then stepping back to view the whole collection. Origins and the architecture of knowledge. We begin with the long-standing intuition that knowledge is more than a lucky hunch or a useful guess. For centuries, philosophers have asked, what is required for a belief to count as knowledge? The traditional anchor is the idea of justified true belief, often presented as a clean triad. You must believe P must be true, and your belief must be justified. The justification is the evidential ground, the reasons you have for thinking P is the case. The truth is the target condition. It's not enough for the reasons to be comforting or compelling in your mind if, in the world, P is false. And the belief itself, your mental state of accepting P as accurate, needs to ride on those ground rules, that justification, that evidential support. To put it simply, the structure is justification plus truth plus belief equals knowledge. If you see a stop sign at the end of a street and you form the belief rightly that you should stop, and the sign is indeed there, then your belief seems justified, true, and held with the right mental stance. The body of justification matters here, not merely the eventual success of the belief. The origins of this way of thinking, at least in its most influential modern form, stretch back to a few towering milestones. In the Theaetetus, Plato entertains the thought that knowledge is true judgment, and then complicates it by insisting that true judgment must come with an account, an explanation or justification that makes the judgment more than a lucky hit. The sense is that to know is to have your true belief anchored in a story that can be told, a narrative that connects the belief to the world in an intelligible way. The phrase often cited, though not always in exactly the same words across translations, is that knowledge is more than a lucky guess. It involves a narrative about why that belief is correct. In the sources we now consult, this is captured less as a strict algorithm than as a structural demand. Agents should be able to cite reasons that tie their belief to the facts. The later revisionist wave in epistemology adds more texture to justification. Descartes, writing in a different mood, embodies the demand for certainty, a confidence grounded in what can be known with clarity and distinctness. In his own way, he is trying to secure a foundation for knowledge, perhaps not with the everyday fallibility we encounter in Gettier-style cases, but with the dream of an immune, indubitable anchor. The canonical exclamation cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, embodies a form of internal certainty, proof that the thinker's mind has access to a foundation that cannot be undermined by ordinary deception. It is a paragon of the internalist intuition. Justification is accessible from within to the thinker and does not depend, at least at this level of analysis, on external conditions that might remain invisible to the subject. And then we meet the Gettier problem, a turn in history that functions like a seismic fault line cutting across a well-lit interior. In 1963, Edmund Gettier published a short paper with a punch that startled both lay readers and specialists. It is possible for someone to have a belief that is justified and true, yet still fail to know that belief. The famous paper posed a challenge by offering cases where the conditions for knowledge as justified true belief appear to be satisfied, while the subject lacks knowledge. The moral is not merely that there are edge cases outside ordinary life. It is that the simple triad may be too fragile, too dependent on the precise ways justification links to truth. A belief can arrive at truth by accident, and justification might be tied to a chain of reasoning that falls apart when you look at the causal or evidential structure carefully. This discovery did not simply undermine a slogan. It invited an entire family of reformulations, refinements, and alternatives. If Gettier cases show us a discontinuity between intuitive success and formal criteria, then the natural next move is to examine the sources of that mismatch. We seek to know whether a more robust notion of justification can be articulated, or whether we should pivot toward externalist pictures of justification, where the reliability of the cognitive process or the actual causal history of belief matters even if the believer cannot access that reliability through introspection. The Gettier challenge, in other words, asks us to take seriously the gap between what seems to count as knowledge in ordinary life and what a formal analysis requires. Key thinkers, arguments, and the structure of debate. The debate has social and philosophical anatomy. On one side, internalist traditions insist that justification must be accessible to the thinker's consciousness, or at least to the thinker's mental organization. The justification must be something the believer can, in principle, point to and explain, a chain of reasons that the believer could articulate without stepping outside the mental life. On the other side, externalist traditions reject the idea that justification must be accessible to the thinker in order for knowledge to obtain. Instead, relevance is given to factors outside the immediate mental life of the believer, how reliable a process is, what its causal history is, and whether the belief would have been formed in the right way even if the believer were not aware of those processes. Let's wander through the corridors of this debate with a few anchors. First, foundationalism versus coherentism. Foundationalists aim for a bedrock, basic beliefs that require no further justification and that justify other beliefs in a hierarchical, linear structure. They want justification to have a secure base, a starting point that does not itself rest on infinitely regressing chains of justification. Coherentists reply that justification is a network, a system of beliefs that mutually support one another. No single belief stands alone. Justification is achieved by coherence across the whole system. In Gettier's light, the question becomes whether a networked, coherent, or foundational system can avoid those pockets of luck that yield justified true beliefs without knowledge. The Gettier problem invites a practical test. Can a coherentist system be structured so that it avoids false lemmas, false steps, and defeaters that would reclassify a true belief as merely lucky? Second, the externalist turn, reliabilism and tracking. The reliabilist tradition, associated with Gilbert Harman and especially with Alvin Goldman, says that justification should be grounded in the reliability of cognitive processes. If perception, memory, or inference reliably track the truth under normal conditions, then beliefs formed by those processes may count as knowledge, even if the thinker has no access to the underlying reliability. The tracking theory of knowledge, championed by Nozick, adds a specific external condition. If P were false, the subject would not believe P. The idea is to tie knowledge to causally robust connections between truth and belief, not only to the subject's internal justificatory reasons. The externalist move aims to repair Gettier's mismatch by shifting the criteria from a purely internal, justificatory story to an externally instantiated reliability. Third, the defeasibility and no false lemmas responses. Several philosophers have proposed strengthening JTB with additional conditions to block Gettier-like luck. One widely discussed route is the no false lemmas constraint. Your justification cannot rely on any false lemmas along the way to the belief. If the chain of reasoning is contaminated by a false step, even if the final belief is true and justified, it should not count as knowledge. The intuition behind that move is straightforward. Even if the ultimate conclusion ends up true, you shouldn't call it knowledge if your justification depended on something false you should have caught or rejected. Related moves appeal to defeasibility. Even if you have justification and truth, a defeater, another piece of information that undermines your justification, could undermine knowledge. In this line of thought, Gettier cases can be repurposed as warnings about how fragile belief tracking can be, and the remedy is to insist on a more robust deflective structure that guards against hidden false notes in the justification. Fourth, safety and epistemic luck. Building on contemporary discussions, some philosophers have argued that knowledge requires safety under nearby possible worlds. A belief is safe if you would not have formed that belief in a nearby world where the proposition is false. The thought is that knowledge must resist nearby counterfactuals. If the world had been just a hair different and the proposition false, your justification would not have delivered a true belief. This family of ideas has grown in the wake of Gettier. If a belief looks justified and true in the actual world but would have been easily false in a small, plausible alternative, perhaps what we have is not knowledge but lucky true belief. The safety notion associated with the work of Ernest Sosa and others offers a way to think about justification as something that withstands variation rather than something that is fixed to a particular actualized chain of reasons. Fleshing out the Gettier problem with fresh examples, Gettier's classic Smith/Jones case is the most cited, but it is not the only mode in which ordinary-looking, domain-transcending processes yield Gettier-like results. To illuminate the breadth of the problem, we'll explore at least two detailed examples beyond the Smith/Jones scenario, showing Gettier-like results in perception, memory, and inference in different domains. These examples will be constructed to be vivid enough to explain in a video script, yet precise enough to ground analytic discussion. Example 1. Perception and the lucky coincidence in a driving scenario. Imagine you are driving down a familiar road on a sunny afternoon. You glance at a street sign as you approach an intersection. The sign is tall and the letters appear crisp from your distance. In your belief-forming process, you see the sign and immediately form the belief. The speed limit on this road is 55 miles per hour. Your justification is purely perceptual. The sign is legible, the font is standard, and the legal boundary seems typical for this zone. You reflexively believe the proposition because you have a perceptual cue, signage that is designed to convey speed limits. But unbeknownst to you, A temporary signage glitch has produced a sign that looks exactly like a 55 mph limit for a completely different road that is temporarily combined with this street due to construction. The actual speed limit on this segment is 45 mph, but a campaign sign in the same font and the same layout left there by a contractor creates a perfect but misleading impression. In that moment, your perceptual evidence, your eyes registering the sign, supports the belief the speed limit is 55 mph. The truth of that proposition, however, is guaranteed not by the sign's content alone, but by the moment's coincidence. The sign you read is in error for the road you are on, while the road itself happens to have the correct limit of 55 mph due to a separate, unrelated change that you did not notice. If you happen by chance to be traveling a stretch where the actual limit is indeed 55 mph, the signage glitch suspends your awareness of the true limit, but the road's actual limit aligns with 55 on that particular segment. Your belief ends up true by luck, even though the justification was to a large extent misapplied. The crucial point is that your justification rests on a perceptual cue that is reliable in many circumstances, but happens to misrepresent this particular scenario. The truth of the proposition is secured by a different cause than your justification's track, and the apparent justification collapses under the weight of the lucky alignment. This case helps show how even reliable perception can produce Gettier-like outcomes. The domain here is perception and immediate, on-the-ground reason-giving. The belief is justified in virtue of a perceptual experience that would typically track the truth. But in this case, the truth that the speed limit is 55 mph depends on an actual feature of the road that your glance missed, and the sign you relied upon does not guarantee the truth of your belief in this context. The Gettier twist surfaces because your belief is true in the actual world. Your justification is sound in most cases. Yet the justification does not guarantee knowledge because the truth of your belief is not anchored by the same basis that produced your justification, and there exists a nearby possibility in which the sign misleads you and your belief would be false. You would still form the belief under ordinary circumstances in which signs are reliable, which makes the case compelling for showing that JTB by itself can be insufficient in practical, real-world perception. This kind of example helps us appreciate a subtle point about the role of evidence and the consumption of justification in real life. Our cognitive systems, our eyes, our ears, our memory, are designed to be reliable in typical circumstances. They are not designed to produce infallible verdicts in every corner of the possible world. Gettier scenarios push us to ask, how much safety, how much defeasibility, and how robust must the justification be to count as knowledge when our evidence can be simultaneously correct and misleading in important respects? And how should we rewrite the structure of justification to account for those everyday vulnerabilities? Example 2, memory-based Gettier-style case in a domestic setting. Now consider a memory-based scenario that strips the epistemic stakes of public life down to something domestic and intimate. You wake up and remember a friend's birthday is today. You have a firm memory. You recall confirming the date last year when you spoke, and you have a digital calendar with an entry that reads, Jane's birthday. The memory seems perfectly justified. You know you checked, you have the calendar entry, and you believe the date is indeed today's. Your belief is true because the date is actually today's, and your friend indeed has a birthday today. The justification you rely on, though, is fragile in an important sense. The memory you have is a privileged access to the information, but the basis for the belief is a sequence of unrelated, independent supports, your memory content plus a calendar entry, that can diverge in a way that would have made your belief false. What makes this Gettier style is not that you were wrong about the date, but that the truth of your belief rests on a lucky confluence of two sources that share nothing to do with the justification for the belief. Suppose, on the morning you wake up, you were excited to celebrate your friend's birthday and had set two independent reminders, one a dated calendar entry and another a voice memo you recorded last year. You look at the calendar and read today's date as your friend's birthday. Your memory supports this belief because you remember having looked at the calendar and you believe your calendar entry when you check it. Yet there is more to the story. Your friend's birthday is today, but the reason you recall the date is not because your memory retrieval is reliable in general. It is because your calendar entry was created by a bright but accidental coincidence with the actual date, and your memory of the event is anchored less in a general reliability than in the fact that both sources align on this particular day. The belief that Jane's birthday is today becomes true by luck, not because your memory justified its truth in a robust, independence-preserving way. If you had asked, what would you think if the calendar entry had been wrong, or if the memory retrieval had produced a different result, you would discover that your justification does not guarantee knowledge across nearby possible worlds. The Gettier twist appears when truth is tethered to independent coincidences and your justification is anchored to a different chain of events. This memory-based scenario serves two purposes. First, it shows that Gettier-like cases are not restricted to fancy lab settings or contrived stories. They emerge naturally in everyday cognitive life, where we rely on memory as a central epistemic resource. Second, it shows how simply having a reliable memory in general does not guarantee knowledge in every specific case, because the truth of the belief can be secured by luck in the arrangement of the supporting evidence rather than by a robust link between justification and truth. Two more Gettier-like cases in the domain of inference. A third example comes from inference, the everyday reasoning we use when we connect things we know or accept into a chain that yields new beliefs. Suppose you infer that your friend will attend a party because the invitation says so, and your friend has a perfect attendance record. Your belief that your friend will attend rests on several premises. The invitation is valid, the event is indeed on, and your friend tends to attend such gatherings. The justification rests on the trustworthiness of the invitation and your friend's past behavior. Yet suppose an unusual set of circumstances arises on the evening of the party. A last-minute cancellation leaves the guest list changed, and your friend, for a reason unrelated to invitations, cannot attend. But on that same night, another event occurs that would ensure that your friend's absence is not noticed, an alternate participation by a different friend who uses the same seat, or perhaps the party is rescheduled for a later night. The actual attendance turns out to be true in terms of your expectation, because your friend ultimately shows up late or someone else fills the role you anticipated. Your inference, though justified in light of the invitation and past patterns, lands on a truth that is secured by coincidence. Two things matter here. One is the structure of the inference itself. The justification rests on a chain of reasoning where each step appears solid, but a hidden dependency ties your final conclusion to a contingent fact that makes it true by accident. The second is the depth of your knowledge. You possess a belief with justification and truth, yet the Gettier twist reveals that the final connection, your certainty that your friend will attend based on the invitation and past patterns, does not guarantee knowledge because a non-essential fact that you did not notice could have changed the outcome. A fourth example, more abstract but still instructive, comes from a rational inference about probabilities and predictive models. Imagine you have a well-calibrated statistical model that predicts outcomes in an uncertain environment. You set the model to predict that a particular event will occur with a certain probability, and you observe a run where the event occurs exactly as predicted. The belief formed by relying on the model is justified by the robustness of the model's past performance, but then a rare yet possible contingency arises that would have produced the same observed outcome even if the event had not occurred in the same way, meaning the probability alignment was a kind of lucky alignment. The model's track record is evidence of reliability, but the specific instance turns out to be one of those fortuitous patterns that do not guarantee knowledge under Gettier's lens. These four scenarios, perception, memory, inference, and probabilistic modeling, are not meant to exhaust the land of Gettier-like cases. They are intended to illustrate, across domains, the persistent tension Gettier revealed. A person can have justification, the belief can be true, and the believer can be perfectly confident, and yet what they possess falls short of knowledge because the truth of the belief hinges on a lucky alignment that does not reflect the strength of the justification in the exact case. Counterarguments to Gettier and the idea that Gettier fully undermines JTB if Gettier is correct in showing a mismatch between intuitive knowledge and the JTB triad. Why do many philosophers still defend JTB as the core of knowledge, at least in ordinary contexts? There are several robust lines of counterargument, and they cohere across a number of positions, including proposals to strengthen JTB, externalist responses, and considerations about the nature of epistemic luck. First, the move to strengthen JTB with no false lemmas or defeasibility. One natural response is to require that the justification for a belief not only be true and grounded, but also be free of false premises along the way. The idea is simple and attractive. If you derive your belief from some false premise, your justification is compromised and the belief cannot count as knowledge. By forbidding false lemmas, we try to block Gettier-style derivations that rely on a false intermediate step. The intuition is that knowledge should not ride on a single lucky turn of events, nor should it be eroded by the presence of any false or questionable premise in the chain that leads to the belief. This approach explicitly targets the readable story of justification. If the story contains a false node, the conclusion is not secure. The no false lemmas constraint becomes a practical interpretive tool for evaluating knowledge claims in everyday reasoning as well as in formal analyses. The challenge, however, is whether such a constraint is too restrictive or too easy to satisfy. The detailed architecture of complex reasoning sometimes involves steps we are not consciously aware of. Thus, the line between a necessary false lemma and a benign assumption may be slippery. Second, defeasibility and the idea of defeating conditions. A closely related way to respond to Gettier is to insist that a knowledge claim must remain undefeated by counter-evidence, even if that counter-evidence is not present at the moment you form the belief. If later information, defeaters, emerges that would undermine your justification or cast doubt on the link between justification and truth, the belief ceases to count as knowledge. This line of thought yields a dynamic understanding of knowledge that grows or decays with new information, rather than a fixed snapshot of justification. It also aligns with the intuitive sense that we often revise our beliefs when confronted with contrary evidence, beyond what the initial justification would allow. The challenge here is to specify precisely what counts as a defeater and under what conditions a belief remains knowledge despite potential defeaters. Defeasibility must be carefully modeled so that it does not swallow knowledge wholesale or become too weak to block Gettier-like outcomes. Third, a robust externalist response, reliabilism and safety. The externalist line invites us to see justification as dependent on the reliability of the cognitive process in producing true beliefs. If the cognitive mechanism that yields the belief is reliable under the relevant conditions, then the belief can count as knowledge, even if the believer cannot articulate or even access the reliability. For example, a person might know that there is a tree outside their window because their visual system, evolved for survival, reliably tracks environmental structure. The justification is not merely internal, but the process that lands the belief is an indicator of truth tracking. The Nozick-style tracking view adds a concrete test. If the proposition were false, the believer would not hold that proposition. This offers a robust way to shield knowledge from Gettier-like luck by tying knowledge to the natural history of belief formation, not merely to a conscious chain of thought. Yet externalism has its own challenges. It can be harder to explain in everyday terms why the believer truly knows something if they have no direct access to the external reliability conditions. It also raises tricky questions about the role of the subject's epistemic responsibilities and whether something can be known if the believer could not articulate why it is true. Fourth, the safety approach. The safety literature adds the element of would this belief have been formed if things had been slightly different? If the answer is no, then we are in safe territory. If yes, and yet the belief turned out true, we are in danger of misclassifying as knowledge. This approach is attractive to many because it preserves the intuitive connection between knowledge and robust reliability under nearby possible worlds. An intuitive way to formalize epistemic luck without rejecting the central intuition that knowledge should be secure against plausible counterfactual variations. The danger, of course, is the precise articulation of nearby worlds and how to measure safety without becoming skeptical about ordinary knowledge. But it is a fruitful line of inquiry, one that has spurred a broad range of debates about how to formulate a defensible theory of knowledge that captures common-sense intuitions while still resisting Gettier-style anomalies. Two short, real-world stakes to bring Gettier into everyday life. 1. The courtroom and evidence. The law often uses a language of justification and warrants that should seem analogous to justification in epistemology. A jury must evaluate the strength of the evidence, the credibility of witnesses, and the reliability of the chain of reasoning that leads to a verdict. A Gettier-like situation could occur when the evidence supports a conclusion that ends up being true, but only because of lucky alignment with unrelated facts and without the justification matching the truth. The question is not only whether a verdict is true, but whether it has been reached on a secure epistemic basis that would resist defeaters, that would be robust to nearby possible worlds where the outcome would be different. This is why legal theory often emphasizes standards of proof like beyond a reasonable doubt as a way to raise the bar above mere justified belief and to guard against luck. 2. AI, decision-making, and reliable systems. In the age of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making, a system might produce a belief or a decision that is true and justified by its training data and algorithms, yet the design of the system or the data it was trained on could create a hidden vulnerability. The Gettier problem invites us to ask, when is a system's belief count as knowledge of the world? Is it enough that the system achieved a true result in this instance, or do we require a robust architecture that ensures that such a correct outcome would be produced in nearby scenarios as well? The move from internal justification to external reliability is particularly resonant here. We want to design systems that are not just successful in this case, but reliable across contexts, so that knowledge-like claims earned by the system do not hinge on luck. Real-world applications and modern interpretations, the Gettier problem is not a museum piece. It has a living afterlife in how scholars discuss justification, evidence, and the conditions under which we know things in science, law, medicine, and everyday life. Let us take a few illustrative threads. First, reliabilism and the safety turn have become central in contemporary philosophy of epistemology. The idea is to shift weight from a purely internalist notion of justification to a theory that takes into account how belief-forming processes function in the real world. In science, this resonates with how theories gain acceptance not just by being justified in a vacuum, but by their predictive power and their track record across experiments, replication, and falsification. The reliability of the sense organs in ordinary perception under typical conditions, and the reliability of the scientific method in controlling variables are the kinds of factors the reliability view wants to foreground. The safety notion adds a further check. Would the belief hold under nearby possible worlds where crucial details differ? In high-stakes contexts, requiring safety helps ensure that scientific or medical conclusions are not merely correct by accident, that they rest on robust, transferable lines of justification. Second, the idea of defeasibility and no false lemmas has shaped contemporary discussions about cognitive biases and the fallibility of human reasoning. In everyday life, we often rely on fast, heuristic reasoning that can be too shallow to reach robust knowledge. Recognizing how defeasibility might undermine our justified beliefs has encouraged the development of strategies to mitigate bias. Slow down, examine intermediate steps, check whether any beliefs rest on questionable premises, and seek additional sources of justification that can resist defeaters. This approach is especially relevant in professional domains like journalism, law, and medicine, where the cost of a wrong belief is high. Third, the externalist and internalist divide remains a central axis in epistemology. The debates have been reframed in light of Gettier. The internalist insistence on accessibility of justification by the thinker pushes philosophers to develop richer theories of justification that can be introspectively accessible and still avoid Gettier-like quirks. The externalist push argues that a knowledge claim can be true and justified even if the thinker cannot articulate all the reasons explicitly, especially if those reasons are external to the internal perspective of the agent. The dialogue between these camps has grown more nuanced with the advent of reliability theories, safety, and the concept of closures and epistemic luck. Cross-references to foundational discussions and later developments as we disassemble and reassemble the notion of knowledge, several cross-references to related theories become essential for depth. Foundationalism versus coherentism. Foundationalists hold that knowledge rests on a base of non-inferential, self-evident beliefs, while coherentists hold that justification is a network of beliefs mutually supporting one another. The Gettier problem challenges both pictures to some extent. If there is a foundational bedrock, can Gettier-like luck slip in through the cracks in the chain of justification without eroding that bedrock? If justification is a coherent structure, can a lucky alignment find a way to make a true belief seem knowledge without the outcomes being anchored to a robust, globally coherent structure? Reliabilism. The reliabilist line insists that justification is a matter of reliability of the cognitive process, perception, memory, inference, across the domain of belief formation. The externalist stance emphasizes the causal and reliability-based connection between belief and truth, rather than the internal justification available to the thinker. But the coexistence of Gettier-like examples invites an important question. Can reliability alone guarantee knowledge, or must reliability be supplemented by a more robust link to justification that ensures the belief is not merely lucky? Safety. The safety approach adds a dynamic counterfactual sensitivity to this story. A belief is safe if, in nearby possible worlds where the belief's content might be false, the belief would not have been formed in the same way. Safety connects to the idea that knowledge should not be easily undermined by small perturbations of the environment. This helps explain why some true justified beliefs in Gettier-like situations fail to count as knowledge. The belief's truth in the actual world might rely on special circumstances that would not hold in nearby worlds. Closure and epistemic luck. The closure principle says that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, you should also know Q. Gettier cases often prompt us to ask whether knowledge is closed under known entailment or whether epistemic luck can disrupt such closure. If the chain from justification to truth to deduced beliefs can be manipulated by luck, the question of whether knowledge closes under entailment becomes both theoretically interesting and practically significant for reasoning across domains. The role of quotes and the voices of primary sources. We can point to primary sources that anchor these discussions. Descartes' famous insistence on certainty, cogito ergo sum, anchors a historical moment when justification is anchored in the certainty of the thinker's own mind. Plato's Theaetetus challenges us to move beyond mere truth to truth that is anchored in a robust account. The famous line in Nozick's work, "If P were false, S would not believe P," provides a hallmark externalist constraint that makes knowledge sensitive to the truth-tracking behavior of the belief-forming process. While Gettier himself asks explicitly, is justified true belief knowledge? His paper opens a space where a more robust notion of knowledge can be explored, including the path toward reliabilism, safety, and defeasibility. And the perennial maxim of Hume, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence," offers a stark reminder that justification is not simply a matter of holding something to be true, but doing so proportionally to the evidence that supports it. Historical anecdotes to illuminate the internalism/externalism. Divide. Two short anecdotes can illuminate how the internalism/externalism divide reframe the debate about justification and accessibility. The first is about how the internalist tradition reads justification. In the mid-20th century, philosophers like Roderick Kishome and others argued that justification must be something the agent has in virtue of its own mental life, how the reasons appear to the thinker from the inside. The internalist view was shaped by the conviction that epistemic authority resides in the mind's accessible structure, not in the externally hidden reliability of cognitive processes. The anecdote here is the sense of epistemic privacy. The thoughts, the reasons, the justifications, the introspective knowledge that is accessible in principle to the subject. The internalist mood accompanies a desire for epistemic transparency. The thinker's justification should be examinable, perhaps even contestable, by the thinker themselves. The second anecdote concerns the externalist reformulation, a move from the private theater of justification to the public theater of truth-conducive processes. The externalist turn emerges most vividly with reliabilism and Nozick's tracking condition. In the 1980s and 1990s, philosophers began to ask, what if a belief is produced by a mechanism whose reliability can be measured in the surrounding world, but where the thinker cannot articulate why the mechanism works? The externalist move is a shift from the mind's internal light to a broader, causal, and often ecological perspective on belief formation. The anecdote here is a shift from "do you have good reasons in your own mind?" to "is your belief produced by a process that reliably tracks truth?" This shift is not merely a technical move about justification. It is a fundamental reframing of what counts as epistemic access. It is the difference between being able to justify something to oneself in a private, introspective way and having one's belief be produced by a mechanism whose reliability does the work, even when the thinker cannot see the mechanism directly. Cross-references to foundational discussions and later developments in this sense, the structure of a knowledge claim invites us to look outward to related theories and later developments. The foundational discussions about justification, foundationalism versus coherentism, provide a backdrop for how to understand Gettier and its offspring. If justification is a chain that rests on non-inferential foundations, can Gettier-like luck slip in at the top? Or does a coherentist system's mutual support structure block those slips by ensuring a robust global coherence? The later developments, reliabilism, tracking theories, and safety notions, offer alternative ways to conceive justification that emphasize external factors and counterfactual robustness rather than a purely internal chain of reasons. Cross-referencing to terms like closure and epistemic luck helps illuminate two central concerns. Whether knowledge is stable under entailment's closure, and Roman II, to what extent luck enters into the claim to knowledge. Gettier cases force us to ask whether the mere fact that a belief is true and justified is enough for knowledge when a lucky alignment can yield truth alongside justification. The ensuing debates push us to refine our understanding of what counts as evidence and how far that evidence must extend beyond the individual thinker's private mental life. Historical anecdotes in the broader history of epistemology show how we have reorganized our views when confronted with Gettier-like surprises. The internalist perspective was, in some ways, a reaction to early modern attempts to anchor justification in the mind's own ideas, with a hope of preserving a certain immediacy and defensibility. The externalist perspective, in contrast, invites a broader, more objective standard for justification that makes knowledge less dependent on what the thinker can consciously articulate. The Gettier problem has, over time, helped the field realize that there is no easy, single criterion that can capture the richness of knowledge across all domains. Quotes from primary sources that illuminate the terrain, we can anchor our narrative with a few exact or near-exact phrases that capture some of the key moments and voices in this history. First, the Cartesian anchor, Descartes in the Meditations, insists on the power of the mind's clarity and certainty in establishing the foundations of knowledge. The famous line, cogito ergo sum, embodies a self-verifying inner certainty that internalists often point to as an example of a justification that is accessible to the thinker. Second, Plato's Theaetetus movement is captured by the general thrust that knowledge is not merely true belief. It requires something more, the account that connects the belief to the world in a way that makes sense within a rational structure. Third, when Nozick codifies the tracking condition, he writes that if P were false, S would not believe P, a condition that aims to connect knowledge with truth-tracking processes in the world, not merely with internal justification. Fourth, Nozick's famous experiential machine example, would you plug in, speaks to a larger philosophical worry about the ground of epistemic justification and whether a life of simulated pleasures suffices for knowledge. And fifth, Gettier's own question, the title of his paper is Justified True Belief Knowledge, serves as the banner under which these debates swing and refine as we move from a simple recipe to a more robust, more nuanced understanding of knowledge. Analogies, structuring dialogue, and pedagogical strategies for lay audiences to illuminate subtle distinctions for a lay audience while retaining analytic rigor. We can structure dialogue in a way that moves from intuitive to technical, from familiar to less familiar, and from concrete examples to abstract principles. A possible dialogue arc might be, begin with a familiar kitchen table example. A friend tells you something you believe to be true and you act on it. The belief sits in your head with justification. Then, a Gettier-like twist shows up. A lucky coincidence occurs that makes your belief true for the wrong reasons. This helps people feel the tension without yet giving them the formal apparatus. Move into the structural core by asking, what is justification? What counts as evidence? What is truth? Why should we care about the relationship among them? Then introduce the internalist versus externalist divide with a simple metaphor. Justification as the internal weather you can sense versus justification as the external weather report that you can rely on even when you do not have access to all the data. Introduce two counterarguments to Gettier. One that strengthens JTB and one that relies on externalism. Use a simple question and answer format. What would be the best way to block Gettier without giving up JTB? How does an externalist account handle Gettier-like curiosity? The audience can see how these options play out against each other. Then bring in modern interpretations and real-world applications. How knowledge claims arise in science, law, and everyday life. How reliability and safety can be operationalized in practice. How AI and machine learning raise questions about when a model truly knows something. Finally, close with a set of reflective questions, linking to historical anecdotes. How did the internalism/externalism debate reframe the accessibility of justification? How might a safety-based epistemology help us understand not only philosophy, but practice in fields like epistemology of science, data science, or jurisprudence? Concrete analogies to help grasp the concept, the building analogy. Knowledge is a building whose foundation is justification, whose walls are the truths that support the claim, and whose roof is the belief's final confidence. Gettier-style luck is a tremor that shakes a wall or a beam. The building might still stand, but the tremor reveals that the structure relied on a fragile chain of support. Strengthening the building, adding no false lemmas, configuring defeaters, or adopting a reliabilist framework reduces the tremor's effect and preserves the building's integrity under stress. The weather report analogy. Justification is the weather report that informs your decision to launch an action, like carrying an umbrella or stepping out into a rainstorm. If the weather report is generally reliable, you might think you know the forecast. But what if there is a rare microclimate that misleads the forecast just in the moment you step outside? The Gettier problem is a test of whether your decision is knowledge or merely luck given that microclimate. The externalist approach would be to insist that what matters is not just the forecast you hold in your mind, but the reliability of the forecast system, including how it would perform under nearby weather variations. The clock and the calendar analogy. You glance at a clock, it reads 3 o'clock. Your belief is justified by the clock's reliability, and it happens to be correct that it is indeed 3 o'clock. A Gettier twist would arise if the clock's mechanism would have misled you in nearby possible worlds. or if your belief about the time rests on a false assumption that the clock's reading is the only way to know the time. The robust theory aims to guarantee that knowledge does not hinge on a single device, but on a network of reliable indicators that would continue to track truth even under near various conditions. Cross-references to suggest further reading in depth if you want to go deeper. These cross-references can guide a richer study. Foundationalism versus coherentism. Look into the classic debate about whether justification rests on non-inferential foundations or on coherence within a system of beliefs. See debates in foundationalist and coherentist approaches to epistemology, including discussions of how Gettier challenges both. Reliabilism and safety. Explore the reliabilist line, with Goldman's classic discussions of truth-conducive reliability and Nozick's tracking theory of knowledge. Then extend to safety, as developed by Sosa and others, focusing on how beliefs must be safe under nearby possible worlds. Externalism and internalism. Read about the long-standing tension between the view that justification must be accessible to the mind and the view that external factors can ground knowledge regardless of the agent's conscious awareness. Epistemic luck and closure. Delve into the literature on epistemic luck and the question of whether knowledge is closed under known entailment. Gettier cases prompt us to examine whether knowledge should be closed under entailment or whether there should be exceptional rules for cases of luck. Defeasibility rules investigate proposals about no false lemmas and other defeasibility constraints that aim to illuminate how knowledge could be preserved even in the face of Gettier-like anomalies. Crucial terms like closure and epistemic luck develop an understanding of the logic of closure in reasoning and how luck enters into our epistemic life, affecting the status of beliefs that we would like to count as knowledge. Foundational references in the primary literature. Read Plato's exploration of knowledge and justification in Theaetetus for historical context. Examine Descartes for the internalist emphasis on certain knowledge. Study Nozick for tracking and the externalist approach. Look at Gettier's original 1963 paper to understand the exact structure of the counterexamples that started this modern debate. Quotes to anchor your understanding and give it life. Descartes, in his Meditations, offers a model of knowledge anchored in the certainty of the thinking subject. The famous maxim, cogito ergo sum, is a touchstone for the internalist mood. It is not a direct verdict on JTB, but it demonstrates how the mind can ground a claim to knowledge in a way that seems immune to ordinary skeptical challenges, at least at the level of the foundational claim. Plato in Theaetetus emphasizes that knowledge is not merely true belief. The belief must be anchored by an account. The justification must connect the belief to the truth in a way that explains why the belief is correct. The spirit of that claim is a challenge to get rid of any assumption that we know simply because a belief is true. There must be a story of justification that makes the truth intelligible. Nozick on knowledge and tracking. If P were false, S would not believe P. This crisp externalist condition gives a precise way to think about knowledge that transcends internal justification and ties knowledge to truth-tracking performance of the cognitive system. The experiential machine thought experiment in Nozick's work, framed as a rhetorical question, captures a central problem with a purely internal sense of good life or justified belief. Would you plug into a machine that would give you any experience you desire? The question calls into relief the difference between a life that feels justified and the life in which the beliefs correspond to the truth in a robust sense. The Gettier question itself is justified true belief knowledge, is the banner we hold as we look at these problems. The problem is not simply a philosophical curiosity. It is a practical invitation to refine or reimagine the concepts that structure how we know things. Real-world implications and a closing reflection. As a closing reflection, consider how Gettier and its successors influence our everyday life, as well as the most serious professional domains. The Gettier problem asks us to be more careful about the sense in which our beliefs commit us to truth. It asks us to consider the role of reliability and the potential vulnerability of belief formation in the face of lucky coincidences. It asks us to acknowledge that sometimes good reasons, good evidence, and true beliefs do not amount to knowledge, precisely because luck sneaks in through a back door. And it asks us to imagine how we can rebuild our accounts of knowledge in a way that preserves the practical reliability of belief while resisting the disorienting and deflating consequences of Gettier-like scenarios. The path forward for many philosophers is not to abandon JTB, but to enrich it. We might insist on general reliability of the processes that form belief. We might insist on a framework that preserves the intuition that knowledge is not merely convenient truth, but truth earned by secure processes. we might also come to see that justification can be a matter of both internal accessibility and external reliability, integrated with a careful account of safety and defeasibility. In practice, this means, in science, the epistemic claim to a theory should rest not only on a stack of internal justifications, but on predictive power, reproducibility, and the absence of systemic defeaters. In law and policy, the strength of knowledge claims should be accessible enough to be scrutinized in the light of counter-evidence, with safety constraints to prevent decisive leaps on lucky, fragile grounds. In everyday life, we cultivate habits of checking intermediate steps, avoiding hidden false lemmas in our reasoning, and seeking additional sources of justification when the stakes are high. In AI and machine learning, we pursue models and data pipelines that minimize epistemic luck by improving reliability, safety, and explicit handling of defeaters, so that decisions that count as knowledge-like claims are robust across plausible near environments. The Gettier twist thus remains a central, living challenge in epistemology, inviting us to refine, revise, and expand our understanding of justification, truth, and knowledge. It invites us to be not only careful about why we believe what we believe, but also thoughtful about the conditions under which those beliefs could constitute knowledge. It asks us to recognize that the world can be generous with true beliefs yet ungrasped by adequate justification, and it challenges us to craft theories that can account for both everyday epistemic success and the more subtle, more troubling cases where luck masquerades as understanding. If we listen closely to the call of Gettier, we hear a longer, richer conversation about what it would take for a belief to count as knowledge in the full, robust sense, something more than a fortunate alignment of evidence and truth, something that can withstand reflection, scrutiny, and the inevitable judgments of time. It is a conversation that is far from settled, and that is precisely why it remains so central to the art of philosophy and the science of thinking well. The structure of a knowledge claim, after all, is not a static blueprint but a living dialogue between the mind that believes, the evidence the mind can marshal, the truth it aspires to, and the many forces of luck, defeasibility, and reliability that shape how those pieces fit together in the grand mosaic of understanding. The Gettier problem did more than unsettle a single definition of knowledge. It opened a floodgate. It showed that the traditional recipe, true belief together with some form of justification, could still yield luck. Beliefs that are true only by accident, despite the confidence with which they are held. The first awfully earnest attempts to salvage knowledge took shape in a trio of landmark ideas from the 1970s and 1980s, each offering a distinct remedy, each insisting that a crucial feature, truth tracking or causation or reliability, could block the Gettier-style luck that plagues ordinary knowledge. In this segment, we walk through these early responses, Nozick's tracking condition, Dretzk's causal theory, and Goldman's reliabilism, before returning to a synthesis that makes visible the shared themes and the threads that link them to later developments in epistemology. First, Nozick and the birth of truth tracking. Let us begin with Robert Nozick, whose track-and-hold instinct for knowledge came in with a bold slogan and a tight condition. Nozick's project in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not to redefine knowledge from scratch, but to block the simplest Gettier-like escape routes by positing a property that a knowing subject's belief must have in order to be robust against lucky breaks. The phrase you'll hear echoed in textbooks and seminars is truth tracking. The structure is compact and sharp. A person S knows that P only if P is true, S believes P, and if P were false, then S would not believe that P. In other words, the belief is not merely correlated with truth or justified by some evidence that happens to line up with reality. The belief would not obtain in nearby possible worlds where P is false. To hear Nozick in his own words is to hear a demand for a strong, counterfactual sensitivity. He stresses the idea with the intuition that knowledge should not be the product of luck that could vanish with a slight shift in how the world is. The tracking condition is, at its heart, a commitment to the idea that what makes a belief count as knowledge is its dependence on the actual truth of P in a way that would collapse if P were false. This is not just justification by virtue of reliable evidence. It is a kind of truth dependence, a counterfactual tether. If the world were different in the relevant way, the belief would not be held. Two illustrative environments designed to show how a tracking condition tries to block Gettier-style luck help orbit this view. The first is the straightforward lamp on case. Imagine you see a lamp lit in a room and you form the belief that the lamp is on. In the nearest possible world where the lamp is off, the light would be absent, and plausibly, you would not believe that the lamp is on under the same evidence. The thing your belief rests on, the visible glow, the lamp's switch position, the electrical source, would not generate your belief if the lamp were off. In that world, your belief would be false, yet you would not continue to hold it under the same evidential balance once the truth status of the lamp changed. The belief in the actual world tracks the truth of "the lamp is on" in a way that would not survive a counterfactual move to a world where the proposition is false. The second example follows the same logic but in a more subtle perceptual setting. A perceptual report about a color. Suppose you look at a wall and believe, with justification from your perception, that the wall is green. In a nearby possible world where the wall's color property had been altered, but only in that very way that would render your belief false, your perceptual evidence would shift in lockstep with P's falsehood. If P were false, you would not form or maintain the belief that P under the same perceptual conditions. The tracking condition therefore screens off a Gettier-like case in which your belief comes out true by accident. In such counterfactual worlds, the belief would not be held. The world's truth would depend on something your consciousness would not have access to if the world were different in the relevant way. To anchor this with a few primary touchstones, consider Nozick's own framing within philosophical explanations, where the tracking idea appears as a way to formalize a robust sensitivity to the truth of P. The essence is captured in the famous operating clause you'll hear quoted. If P were false, S would not believe P. The emphasis is not merely that beliefs align with truth in the actual world, but that the belief's formation would not have occurred in a nearby world in which P were false. If P's truth depended on some contingent feature of the actual world that could have been otherwise, a belief that P would not be sustained in that nearby world. The upshot is a powerful skepticism about Gettier-style luck. For a belief to be knowledge under Nozick's rubric, it must face a counterfactual test, not merely a retrospective check of justification. Two illustrative, concrete cases help sharpen what this means in practice. The first is a simple, everyday perceptual judgment with a clear, verifiable counterfactual. You wake up and see that the street is dry. You believe rightly that it has not rained recently. In a nearby world where the weather feature that makes the street dry were altered, say, the rain had occurred an hour ago and left no puddles, while the ground remains dry due to drainage, the truth of it is not raining now would hinge on a difference that would undermine your belief if P were false. The relevant alternative would be a world in which a single environmental switch flips, making P false, and where, crucially, your perceptual process under that counterfactual would not give you the belief. Your current belief, then, tracks the truth in just the way Nozick requires. In the nearby world where P is false, the belief would not be produced or would not be believed. The second example is subtly more technical, involving a normal use of a tool or instrument. Suppose you are testing whether a clock reads 3 p.m. by looking at its face. Your belief that the time is 3 p.m. rests on the clock's display. Now imagine a nearby possible world in which the clock's display is misleading or defective in a precise, counterfactual sense. If the time were not 3 p.m., the display would flip to a different reading, and you would not believe it is 3 p.m. under that hypothetical. The counterfactual behavior of the device, under the condition that P is false, would preclude your belief in that nearby world. The belief now counts as tracking truth because it would not survive a world in which P were false, given the same evidence you depend on. In this Nozickian mood, we should see two powerful points about the reception and the aims of truth tracking. First, truth tracking is designed to be a robust, counterfactual safeguard against luck. It asks not only whether your belief is supported by good evidence and whether it happens to be true, but whether the very mechanism by which the belief is formed would fail if the world were different in the relevant way. Second, the approach has an appeal to a kind of common-sense realism about knowledge. A genuine knowing subject's belief should not be a mere residue of happy coincidences. It should be anchored in how the truth would slip away if the world were otherwise. In the reception of Nozick's proposal, the 1970s and 1980s epistemology community found a fresh, provocative dimension to the Gettier problem. The idea that knowledge rests on a counterfactual sensitivity to truth resonated with a broader interest in externalist theories, those that place emphasis on facts about the world beyond the subject's internal states. Nozick's tracking condition thus connected with discussions of whether knowledge should be tied to actual causal or dependence relations with truth rather than to internal justification alone. It also provoked a vigorous dialogue about the nature of nearby possible worlds, about how we should model relevant ways the world could be different, and about what counts as the relevant difference that would make a belief false. Two parallel lines of critique and refinement soon emerged. Some philosophers challenged whether a tracking condition could avoid all Gettier-like cases while remaining faithful to ordinary knowledge claims. Others worried about overbreadth. Would tracking imply that many ordinary beliefs, perhaps even those we feel confident about in everyday life, don't qualify as knowledge because there might be plausible nearby worlds where, if P were false, we would not believe P under the same evidence? And there arose a broader philosophical conversation about how to relate these externalist mechanisms to other central epistemological questions, including the closure of knowledge. If you know P and you know Q, do you automatically know P and Q together? Or the status of Gettier-style exceptions within a more general theory of justification. Two historical anecdotes illuminate this early reception. Anecdote 1. In the wake of Gettier's famous 1963 paper, the 1970s saw a lively cross-pollination in seminars and journals as philosophers debated whether a tracking-like condition could rescue knowledge from Gettier problems without collapsing ordinary knowledge into an overly brittle regime. The debate often flared around whether the counterfactual condition should be merely about belief or about justification, about the entire causal chain of belief formation, or about more subtle virtue-like dispositions. Anecdote 2. The 1980s witnessed a flourishing of externalist theories. Dretsk's causal theory and Goldman's reliability approach arose in direct conversation with Nozick's ideas, and the resulting discussions, alongside contrasts with internalist responses, helped pivot epistemology toward a more pluralist landscape. In the corridors of philosophy departments, seminars on truth tracking and causality in knowledge were not rare, they were typical. The conversations helped seed a broader move in epistemology, from the uneasy reconciliation of Gettier with internalist rationality to the embrace of externalist mechanisms that could defend knowledge without demanding that every belief be freely rejustified by introspective, internal reasons. From Nozick to Dretsk, a shift toward causation. If Nozick gave us a powerful counterfactual criterion for knowledge, the next major wave of response pressed more directly on the causal link between truth and belief. David Dretsk's approach is a careful, ambitious attempt to answer the same Gettier problem by insisting that knowledge rests on a robust causal connection, the fact that P must be the cause of SS belief that P. The idea is simple in its direction and deep in its consequence. If you know that P, then your belief that P must be caused by the very fact P. If P were the cause of your belief, then a world in which P were false would have to fail to produce that belief. If, however, your belief is produced by a non-causal source, perhaps by a lucky inference, a coincidental alignment, or a brain process that happens to align with the truth without it being caused by the truth itself, then your belief would fail to be knowledge, even if it happens to be true. Dretsk's signature claim, crystallized in Knowledge, an introduction to the theory of knowledge, is that knowledge is a strengthening of true belief by the fact that the fact itself provides the cause of belief. The facts being the cause of your belief creates a robust explanatory link that, on his account, matters more than purely subject internal justification. He is not denying that justification matters, but he is giving a crucial, objective mechanism, causal connection, for how truth becomes propulsive in the mind to generate belief, rather than merely being a byproduct of luck or of irrelevant correlates. A short, punchy line from Dretsk can help anchor this sense of his position. The idea that knowledge is the result of a true belief whose truth is essential to the believer's mental state, i.e., the belief is caused by the truth rather than caused by something else that merely correlates with truth. In his terms, we can say, a belief is knowledge only if the world's facts cause the belief. The precise wording in his work is intricate, but the spirit is clear. Causal entitlement matters for knowledge, not just justification or belief formation processes in a vacuum. Two illustrative examples help to see why this causal angle matters. The first is a straightforward perceptual case. Imagine you look out the window and see a tree, and you form the belief that there is a tree outside. The thing that makes your belief true is the fact that there indeed is a tree outside, and that fact has a causal role in your experience. The tree's presence casts light, produces visible features, triggers the sensory system, and your cognitive appraisal follows. The causal chain runs from the fact, the tree's existence, to your mental state perception, to your belief, there is a tree. If the tree weren't there, if there were no tree, and if this were the counterfactual world in which the tree's presence is the only thing changing, your belief would not be formed in the same way, or would not be formed at all. In short, the belief tracks the truth through a causal route. The second example pushes the idea into a more technical domain, a chain of transmission in which a fact generates evidence that supports a belief. Suppose you believe the alarm will ring at 7 a.m. because a clock at your bedside is functioning properly, and the clock's mechanism ensures the alarm's ring is causally connected to the actual moment. The fact that the alarm will ring is the cause of your belief. If the alarm failed, or if the clock were miswired in the right way to produce a belief of 7 a.m. regardless of the actual time, the causal connection would collapse and your belief would not count as knowledge. The key is the causal reliance of the belief on the truth. From Dretsk's vantage point, then, knowledge is secured by something like a chain of causation that ties the truth of P to the believer's mental state. This is a robust response to the Gettier problem, because it insists that a merely lucky true belief, one that happens to be true by accident, lacks the causal tie that makes it a knowledge-bearing state. If a Gettier scenario crops up where the belief is true but the fact does not cause the belief, Dretsk's account would deem such a belief not to be knowledge. Two counterarguments quickly emerge for Dretsk, and they form part of the broader wave of debate that followed. First, Gettier-like counterexamples can arise where there is a genuine causal chain that links P to the belief, yet the belief still seems to be knowledge-lacking in an epistemic sense. Think of a case in which a person forms a belief because of a causal chain that includes a misleading intermediate step. Perhaps the causal chain is intact and the belief is true, but the chain depends on a lucky falsehood in a way that would mislead a careful observer. In such cases, the belief's truth may be explained via causation, but the justificatory or reliability aspects might be questioned, and some philosophers will argue that the belief still seems too lucky to count as knowledge. Second, a stronger worry is about overprecision. If the criterion is, the fact must cause the belief, then we might predict knowledge only in contexts where there is an explicit, traceable causal link within a short, interpretable chain. But our everyday knowledge often involves more diffuse, long, and intricate causal networks. Our ordinary acts of knowing, I know that the meeting is at 3, may rest on social practices, memory, or environmental cues that do not have a single clean cause in the sense Dretsk requires. Critics worry that the causal criterion could be too demanding, or at least too fragile, for many ordinary knowledge claims. If the world's causal structure is complex or underdetermined, does Dretsk's condition render much of our knowledge impossible? Two historical anecdotes illustrate the reception of Dretsk's causal theory in the 1980s epistemology scene. The first anecdote centers on the lively discussions between Dretsk and other externalists who emphasized the world's role in shaping belief. The second involves a broader shift in epistemology toward externalist explanations of knowledge, a shift that gained speed with the perceptual and cognitive sciences' improved understanding of how information flows from the environment into the mind. Dretsk's idea helped crystallize a new mood. Knowledge demands more than justificatory internal coherence. It demands that the truth have a causal seat in the believer's cognitive life. And that shift toward insisting on actual explanatory links between truth and belief paved the way for later discussions of explanation, information, and causality in epistemology, including debates about closure and about how our knowledge might be sensitive to the reliability of the mechanisms that produce belief. Two immediate themes connect Dretsk to Nozick and to later developments. The first is a persistent emphasis on some form of external link between truth and belief. Nozick's counterfactual truth tracking demands a relation to truth across nearby possible worlds. Dretsk's causal link demands a link in the actual world's causal structure. The second is a shared concern with the nature of luck. In both stories, Gettier-like luck is barred not by a merely subjective sense of justification, but by a structural feature of how belief forms and how truth interacts with belief formation. A brief cross-reference. The language of causation in Dretsk nudges philosophers toward questions about the reliability of causal relations in knowledge, questions that would later become central in the reliability-based approach of Goldman, and more broadly, in the venture toward externalist accounts that tie knowledge to stable facts about the world. The causal theory also feeds into broader conversations about the nature of justification, and whether justification must be internal to the agent or can reside in the environment or in causal relations between the mind and the world. In that sense, Dretsk's move is a signal flare for later externalist approaches and for the development of a more robust theory of knowledge that accommodates the ways information travels from world to agent. From Dretsk to Goldman. The rise of reliability as the core if Nozick's tracking condition and Dretsk's causal theory anchored knowledge in counterfactual dependence and causal connection. Alvin Goldman's reliabilism redirected the conversation toward the reliability of the processes by which beliefs are formed. Reliability, in Goldman's hands, is not a vague notion of trustworthy in the moral sense. It is an objective, functionally testable property of mental processes. A belief counts as knowledge if it is produced by a process that tends to yield true beliefs more often than not. The key move is to shift the criterion away from internal justification and toward the structural reality of the belief-forming mechanism. perceptual processes, memory, inference, test-taking strategies, or other cognitive procedures that have a proven tendency to produce true beliefs in the relevant environment. Goldman's reliabilism is elegantly simple to articulate. If your belief that P comes from a process with high reliability and the belief is true, then you know P. The truth is essential, of course, but the claim that counts for reliability is the process's track record, not the immediate evidence or its justificatory status in your mind. A reliable articulations of the process is the boon. A belief produced by a reliable process and true is knowledge. The confidence in reliability is not a mere afterthought, but the bedrock of what makes belief knowledge in his framework. Two illustrative examples help convey how Goldman aims to block Gettier slips via reliability. The first is perceptual knowledge. You see a tree and form the belief that the tree is there. Perception has, under normal environmental circumstances, a robust tendency to yield true beliefs about the presence of trees. Even if a particular instance of seeing a tree might be misled by lighting or atmospheric effects, the general reliability of the perceptual mechanism ensures that, in the relevant range, your belief is reliable. The second example is memory. You form the belief that you had breakfast this morning based on a memory that has proven reliable in your experience. If memory tends over time to yield true beliefs about past events more often than not, then that memory state justifiably supports knowledge of the past event, provided the belief is true. The reliability criterion is straightforward here. Goldman's reliability approach thus offers a robust reply to Gettier luck in at least two important ways. First, it grounds knowledge in the functional history of belief formation. A belief that arises from a process with a high success rate is a sign that the belief is likely to be true. This provides a mechanism by which true beliefs acquired via legitimate mechanisms can survive the very concerns that Gettier cases exploit. The possibility that a belief is true only by luck. Second, it invites a more general framework for evaluating knowledge claims across different cognitive modalities. If perception is reliable, if memory is reliable, and if inference is reliable, then beliefs generated through those channels can count as knowledge, third-party processes, long-run reliability, and the like, rather than requiring that every belief be traced back to an infallible internal justification. Two counterarguments quickly emerged in the 1980s and beyond. The first is the Gettier-like obstacle. Can a belief still be the product of a reliable process but be true only by luck? Consider a scenario where a memory process is highly reliable most of the time, but in a particular, highly contrived Gettier case, the belief happens to be true in a way that does not rely on the process's reliability for that instance. If the process functioned differently in that particular instance, the belief could have been false, despite the process's general reliability. The challenge is to shape a reliabilist response that preserves the integrity of the reliability dependence even in such pathological cases. The second counterargument concerns the breadth of reliability. If knowledge requires a reliable process, what counts as reliable in the environment where the belief is formed? Real-world reliability can be sensitive to context. A process that is reliable in ordinary conditions might fail in extreme or pathological environments. If we take reliability too broadly, might reliabilism end up endorsing all sorts of beliefs as knowledge simply because the processes that generate them are often reliable in typical contexts? This is the overbreadth worry. Reliabilism might end up counting as knowledge many beliefs we would not ordinarily treat as knowledge, or it might miss knowledge in rare contexts where reliability is compromised in subtle ways. Two historical anecdotes illuminate how reliabilism reverberated in the 1980s and beyond. Anecdote 1 concerns the reception in different epistemic communities. Some philosophers praised reliabilism for its intuitive appeal and its alignment with scientific psychology and cognitive science, the mind as a processor that relies on reliable mechanisms. They welcomed a theory that could be tested against empirical data about perception, memory, and inference. Others, by contrast, worried that reliabilism could license a kind of global reliabilist inflation, where many beliefs simply because they arise from reliable processes would count as knowledge, even if the agent has no reason to trust those processes in particular cases. The debate, in other words, moved toward nuanced questions about which processes count as reliable in which environments and how to calibrate reliability to different contexts. A second anecdote concerns the broader philosophical climate in epistemology, especially debates about internalism versus externalism. Reliability as a criterion is inherently externalist. It looks to the process's properties, which often lie outside the subject's direct introspection. The reliabilist turn helped anchor externalist approaches in the wake of Gettier, reinforcing the sense that knowledge need not be tethered to what a thinker could justify or explain to themselves via internal rational reflection. The reliabilist mood fed directly into later discussions about safety, as in Sosa's later virtue-theoretic analysis, contextualism, and other externalist accounts that sought to explain how knowledge could be robust in practice, even if the agent's internal architecture remains fallible. In short, reliabilism helped institutionalize a shift toward externalist explanations that would mature into more sophisticated theories of knowledge, including safety and virtue approaches, in the 1990s and 2000s. Why these three lines of response matter in synthesis: the Nozick, Dretsk, and Goldman trio, truth tracking, causal connection, reliability, each aims to block the Gettier problem by appealing to different structural features of belief formation and of the relationship between truth and belief. They share a common concern: a genuine knowledge state must do more than merely be true or be justified by reasons that happen to align with truth. They insist that there be a principled link, counterfactual, causal, or reliability-based, between the fact known and the belief formed. In that sense, they are siblings in the externalist family, each proposing a different mechanism by which the truth of P should be connected in a robust way to the believer's cognitive state. If we trace the threads across these theories, we can name a few shared themes that will echo in later developments. The central role of the environment in shaping knowledge tracking depends on nearby possible worlds. Causal theory ties knowledge to actual facts in the environment. Reliability depends on how the environment and cognitive machinery interact with belief formation. A persistent challenge to internal-only accounts that treat justification as a purely internal matter, and a clear preoccupation with the problem of how ordinary beliefs can count as knowledge without slipping into radical skepticism or into an overbroad account that grants knowledge too easily. From there, the conversation historically moves toward tensions between internal and external factors, between the demand for a robust explanatory link to truth and the practical matter of knowing in ordinary life. The discussions also set the stage for further refinements and reforms. Sosa's later safety conditions, contextualist developments that recalibrate what counts as knowledge in different contexts, and the sophisticated virtue epistemology line that looks at the character and reliability of the knower rather than at a single process. The closure of knowledge problem, whether knowing P and knowing Q ensures knowing their conjunction, also becomes a touchstone for these debates, because any candidate theory has to accommodate how knowledge behaves under logical composition. Cross-references to related thinkers and ideas are everywhere in this story. The tracking approach shares with contextualism a concern for how the context of evaluation matters to knowledge claims, though contextualism emphasizes conversational conditions for knowledge rather than counterfactual dependence per se. The causal theory intersects with broader discussions in philosophy of science about explanation and causation, and it foreshadows concerns with information-theoretic accounts of knowledge that would appear in later decades. The reliabilist story anticipates, in interesting ways, some of the developments in cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. If knowledge is the product of reliable processes, then a good theory of knowledge looks not just inside a thinker's head, but at the reliability of the processes by which the mind engages the world. Real-world applications and modern interpretations. If we fast forward from the seminar room to real-world thinking, these three theories have resonances in domains ranging from medical diagnosis to legal reasoning, from eyewitness testimony to AI systems. A reliability-based account naturally aligns with how doctors evaluate diagnostic tools. If a diagnostic instrument tends to yield accurate results across a broad array of cases, the belief formed from its reading is more likely to be knowledge in the clinical sense. A causal theory of knowledge resonates with the insistence on traceable causal links in scientific practice. If the fact that a patient has a particular disease causes the clinician's belief about the diagnosis, the belief's epistemic status is strengthened. Truth tracking speaks to the design of reliable human-computer interfaces and decision support systems. If a belief tracking mechanism can reliably track the truth across plausible counterfactual shifts in data, the believer's judgment deserves to be trusted under normal conditions of use. In more everyday spheres, these approaches illuminate how we assess information in a world saturated with sources of varying reliability. Our epistemic life becomes a matter of mapping the reliability of perceptual channels, the causal chains that turn facts into beliefs, and the environment's influence on what sorts of beliefs are likely to be true. The modern interpretations of these themes have led to a much richer landscape. Sosa's later safety theory, for instance, can be read as a refinement and a synthesis that carries forward these concerns. Safety, in Sosa's sense, is a way to capture when a belief would not easily have been false in nearby worlds, a concern that has resonance with truth tracking and reliability, and a concern that migrates toward a robust, virtue-centered account of knowledge. Contextualists take up the same baton from another angle, stressing how the evaluation of knowledge can depend on the conversational context, the stakes, and the standards of the particular inquiry. The broad family of externalist theories, of which tracking, causation, and reliability are central members, thus remains a significant current in contemporary epistemology, continuing to shape how we talk about knowledge in law, science, policy, and everyday life. A synthesis of shared themes and a map forward to bring the thread together, a few strands stand out. First, all three approaches, truth tracking, causation, reliability, are united by a common aim: to block Gettier-style luck by appealing to a structural feature of how beliefs connect to truth. They insist that the mere fact of a belief's truth, or its internal justification, is not sufficient for knowledge. There must be a robust mechanism that ties belief to truth in a way that would fail if the belief were false. Second, these theories foreground a robust form of externalism. Knowledge is not simply a matter of what runs inside a knower's head, but how the world, the environment, and the cognitive system interact to produce belief. Third, each theory raises the question of how to calibrate the conditions across various contexts and environments, how to account for ordinary knowledge claims, everyday perception, memory, and inference, as well as more specialized domains in science and medicine. And fourth, the debates they sparked fed naturally into later developments: Sosa's safety, de Rose's contextualism, and the broader turn to virtue epistemology, future paths that sought to preserve knowledge's objectivity while acknowledging the complex mechanics of belief formation. Now, to connect with the broader history and other major ideas, it is worth noting how these early reliabilist and externalist currents opened channels to other significant problems and solutions. The closure of knowledge, the question of whether knowing P and knowing Q entails knowing their conjunction, gained new life in the wake of Gettier and the subsequent reliabilist tradition. If knowledge depends on a reliable process or a causal chain, how does the knowledge of P and Q relate to the knowledge of P and Q together? Sosa's safety analysis later addressed similar grounds by insisting that knowledge should be insensitive to certain nearby falsehoods. Contextualists built on the notion that knowledge is sensitive to the context of evaluation, such that the same belief might be knowledge in one practical context but not in another, depending on the standards of inquiry and the stakes involved. Virtue epistemology, too, matured in dialogue with these concerns by focusing on the intellectual character traits and dispositions that produce reliable belief formation in the long run. The Gettier problem's first wave, Nozick, Dretz, Goldman, thus seeded a rich field of inquiry in which the investigation into the nature and criteria of knowledge would stay lively for decades. Two more historical anecdotes to illuminate the era's texture. Anecdote 3 concerns the atmosphere in epistemology during the 1980s, when these theories were actively debated in journals, conferences, and graduate seminars. The field was alive with a sense that we needed more than mere coherentist justification or a simple true belief plus justification formula. The debates often took on a practical flavor. How should we think about epistemic agents who rely on perceptual devices, memory, or inference under real-world conditions? Institutions hosted panels comparing Nozick's tracking with Dretz's causal theory and Goldman's reliabilism, and the conversations spilled into discussions about how to model knowledge in artificial systems and in social epistemology. Anecdote 4 touches on how these ideas influenced later reformulations: the shift toward externalist, process-based accounts, the emergence of safety concerns in the wake of Sosa, and the move toward virtue-centered analyses. The early 1980s were a crucible in which the Gettier problem's consequences rippled beyond the immediate problem of whether a particular belief qualifies as knowledge, into broader questions about how knowledge should be defined, tested, and validated in a world of potent, real-world information flows. Cross-references to further theories and debates as we step back, we can trace clear lines from this early trio to later developments in epistemology. Sosa's safety condition is a direct descendant of the same practical impulse that motivated truth tracking, causation, and reliability. To ensure that knowledge would not fail simply because the world had shifted in a way that would undermine an otherwise true belief. Contextualism, championed by de Rose and colleagues, shares with the earlier approaches a concern for how the standards of knowledge vary with context, though it emphasizes conversational conditions rather than counterfactual sensitivity or process reliability. And then there is the broader question of the closure of knowledge. The original triptych, Nozick, Dretz, Goldman, pushed us toward treating knowledge as dependent on something more robust than mere justification. Yet the field would still wrestle with whether knowledge is closed under implication when Gettier-like problems show that even strong internalist accounts falter. In addition, these theories intersect with classic discussions in epistemology about the nature of justification and the relationship between justification and truth. The tracking condition suggests a form of truth-sensitive justification that hinges on how beliefs would change under counterfactual variations. The causal theory anchors justification in a world-lending, cause-and-effect story. The reliabilist approach shifts the ground to the empirical reliability of cognitive processes. Taken together, they sketch a family of externalist approaches that remain central to contemporary debates about justification, knowledge, and skepticism. Quotes from primary sources to anchor the discussion to bring a few voices into sharper relief. Here are succinct, representative lines you might recognize as echoing the primary literature. From Nozick, Philosophical Explanations. If P were false, S would not believe P. This sentence sits at the heart of the truth-tracking criterion, articulating the counterfactual sensitivity that Nozick sees as essential to knowledge. It is a compact statement of a larger claim about how belief must be tied to truth in a way that would not survive a change in the world's truth conditions. From Dretz, Knowledge, an introduction to the theory of knowledge. The fact that P must be the cause of SS belief that P. The idea here is that knowledge requires a genuine causal connection between the fact known and the believer's mental state, so that the truth of P is not a mere correlate of belief but its explicit cause. From Goldman, Knowledge and Relevant Alternatives and Related Works on Reliability, a belief is knowledge if it is produced by a process that is reliable. This formalizes a core claim. The epistemic status of a belief should track the empirical reliability of the mechanism by which it is produced, not simply its justification or its outward appearance. These are not long quotations. They are compact enough to be used in script form and to be read aloud with appropriate emphasis during narration. They capture the core commitments of each position and illustrate how primary sources frame the central ideas. Synthesis and transition to the future. As we end this segment, we see how these early responses to Gettier, truth tracking, causation, reliability, set up a spectrum rather than a single answer. They each aim to block luck by anchoring knowledge to a structural feature of belief formation, a counterfactual dependence on truth, a causal tie between fact and belief, or a reliable process that tends to yield truth. The conversations these theories spawned did more than address an abstract problem in epistemology. They oriented much subsequent thinking toward movement beyond internal justification as the sole arbiter of knowledge. They encouraged us to ask, what makes a belief robust in real-world settings? What counts as the real evidence for belief if the mind is embedded in a complex environment? And how should we evaluate knowledge claims when the world contains background roles that shape what counts as evidence or reliability? In moving forward, the conversation would turn to the safety of knowledge, to the contextual sensitivity of knowledge claims, and to broader virtue-theoretic and externalist treatments. Sosa's later safety analysis would take up the same charge of blocking error, while introducing a nuanced account of the knower's virtue-like reliability over time. Contextualists would argue that knowledge can depend on the standards of inquiry and the situation in which a claim is made, thereby reconciling robustly with practical contexts where stakes matter. Virtue epistemology would push further by focusing on the knower's intellectual character and dispositions that reliably yield true beliefs. The Gettier problem thus did not vanish. It matured into a suite of theories that broadened the conceptions of knowledge, each preserving a core intuition. Knowledge should be more than right beliefs under dull circumstances. Knowledge should be structurally tied to truth in ways that survive the kinds of clever tricks Gettier cases deploy. And if we look to the present, these early discussions still echo. When we evaluate information today, whether in medical decision-making, in the reliability of news sources, or in design of AI that interprets data, the questions these theories raised have a practical, urgent feel. How reliable are the processes that generate belief in a given domain? What counterfactual variations could undermine truth in a way that would matter for knowledge? Are there causal links in the data that justify belief, or do we require a more general mechanism that guarantees truth over time? The Gettier problem, far from being a historical curiosity, remains a living prompt for how we conceptualize knowledge in a world saturated with information, misinformation, and ever more intricate cognitive machinery. If you want to branch these ideas further, you can trace how Sosa reframes reliability into a safety condition that allows us to appreciate the knower's virtue across possible worlds. You can explore Day's and Rose's contextualist approaches that emphasize how everyday conversational settings shape what counts as knowledge. You can also examine contemporary debates about AI epistemology, where reliability of algorithms, causal explanations, and counterfactual sensitivity all come into play as we ask whether machine-generated inferences qualify as knowledge, or whether something uniquely human about understanding the truth is still a necessary part of the answer. To close this portion of the journey, let me leave you with a question to ponder while you listen to the next section. If knowledge must be tracked by truth, caused by truth, or produced reliably by a process, which of these criteria speaks most clearly to your own sense of what it means to know something in daily life? Do you gravitate toward a counterfactual test of truth, a causal link to the fact, or a demonstration that your belief-forming process tends to produce true beliefs? Or do you find that none of these captures your sense of knowledge fully, pushing instead toward a blended approach that your future self or your future interlocutors might refine? As we move forward, these questions will continue to animate the moving frontier of epistemology, and the stories of Nozick, Dretske, and Goldman will, for many readers, still feel immediate, still feel essential, and still feel deeply human in the way they confront the stubborn but fundamental question. What does it take to know something, and how do we know it? We begin with a map of the terrain. Gettier flipped the script. Knowing, not merely believing, depends on more than luck, but the problem wasn't solved by a single, simple tweak. Instead, a plural landscape opened up. Today, when philosophers talk about Gettier-inspired remedies, they tend to cluster around a few big families of response. Some insist that knowledge must ride on a robust causal connection between the world and the believer. Others say that safety or anti-luck conditions must be satisfied so that belief could not have easily gone wrong even in nearby possible worlds. Still others center on the agent, arguing that proper functioning of cognitive faculties or the presence of intellectual virtues is what grounds knowledge. Contextualists remind us that what counts as knowledge shifts with conversational context. Coherentists and anti-realist countermodels push back by appealing to the coherence of a system of beliefs or by offering non-classical, sometimes social or pragmatic, alternatives. Bayesian and probabilistic approaches step forward as a formal framework, recasting justification and knowledge in degrees of belief and rational updating. And through all of this, the specter of naturalized epistemology looms. Can our ordinary science of mind, including insights from psychology and cognitive science, bear on questions about knowledge? And does experimental philosophy, with its techniques for testing intuitions in the lab, support or challenge these theories? So we start with a landscape map, and then we drill into each approach with a mini-case study, pause for the counterarguments, note some historical notes that anchor the movement, and finally turn to how these theories would treat knowledge in science, memory, testimony, and everyday belief. Along the way, I'll weave in some primary sources, some historical anecdotes, and a few vivid examples to keep the discussion live, concrete, and usable beyond the classroom. Causal theories of knowledge. The robust link between belief and fact, the core intuition of causal theories, is clean and bruisingly simple. To know something is to have a belief that is causally linked to the fact hoped to be known, in the right way and for the right reasons. This lineage runs from Fred Dretske's influential insistence that knowledge is a belief that is caused in the right way by the fact it represents, to Alvin Plantinga's later insistence on warrant and proper function, which adds a normative dimension about the reliability of cognitive faculties under proper functioning. The causal story is offered as a way to wrest away the luck that Gettier cases exploit. If the belief's connection to the truth is genuinely robust, then a lucky true belief, where the truth happened to land in the belief by accident, won't count as knowledge. Two concrete examples from this approach will help illuminate how a causal theory would handle Gettier cases and where it might still face trouble. Example 1, the powered cognitive path. Imagine a scientist looking at a real instrument panel. The panel displays a true electrical fault indicator. The fault is at Q-42. The scientist forms the belief there is a fault at Q-42 by reading the display. The display itself is functioning properly, and the fact there is a fault at Q-42 causes the belief through a reliable chain. The sensor detects the fault, transmits a signal to the display, the scientist reads the signal and forms the belief. The causal chain is intact. The fact causes the belief via a mechanism designed to report truth. Here, the causal theory says we have knowledge because there is a robust causal link from the fact, the fault at Q-42, to the belief there is a fault at Q-42. There is no Gettier-style accident about whether the belief would easily have been formed had the world been slightly different. The connection is not a byproduct of luck. It is properly caused by the fact in a chain designed to preserve truth. Example 2, the color vision case with a twist. A botanist looks at a leaf she sees as green. The leaf is indeed green due to chlorophyll, and her belief the leaf is green is caused by the leaf's color, the visible green light the eye detects, and the processing chain that translates that signal into belief. Now suppose the leaf looks green not because of real chlorophyll, but because a rare kind of lens artifact makes green appear green, and suppose that, by coincidence, the same artifact would have made any leaf appear green in this moment. The botanist's belief would still be caused by the leaf's color in exactly the right way, but the truth of the leaf is green depends on a perceptual trick that could easily fail. A strict causal theory would push back. To count as knowledge the causal chain from the fact the leaf is green to the belief needs to be robust and explanatory, not fragile or dependent on the artifact. If the source of information is a trick conjuring green appearances, even if the belief lands true in this case, a causal theory will say it doesn't meet the conditions for knowledge. Two counterarguments to causal theories arise naturally. First, the problem of tracking across possible worlds. Causal theories emphasize that a belief must be caused by the truth in the actual world, but it is notoriously difficult to specify how causation should be assessed across nearby worlds. What counts as the right causal path? If in a nearby possible world the same belief would be formed for a different reason, or the cause would be different, should that undermine knowledge in the actual world? The challenge is to formulate a robust, precise condition on the causal link that survives Gettier-style twists without becoming too stringent to exclude genuine knowledge. Some critics worry that we will need an overly fine-grained story about the causal history of every belief, a story that becomes unwieldy in real-world cases, especially for memory and testimony, where causal histories are long, tangled, and often not fully knowable. Second, the problem of circularity and reliability. If the causal link requires reliability in the environment, we face a version of circular justification. To know, the cognitive faculty must be reliable in the world as a whole. But how do we certify the reliability of faculties in the first place? If we appeal to naturalized, empirical evidence for reliability, we may find ourselves in a loop. We measure reliability by looking at performance, but performance is what we're trying to explain. Plantinga's own move, linking warrant to proper functioning of cognitive faculties designed for truth-seeking, seeks to escape this by appealing to an external design or internal teleology. Yet critics push back. What counts as proper function can seem subjective, and in highly artificial or novel environments, even a normally functioning faculty can misfire with no lesson about knowledge. The broader worry is a form of circularity. You measure reliability by observing success, but how do you know you've observed sufficient reliability if you're measuring whether beliefs are knowledge? Historical note and anecdote. The roots of the causal approach intersect with the naturalistic turn of epistemology, a move that Quine and others championed in the late 20th century. It's no accident that this strand resonates with naturalized epistemology and with experimental philosophy. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers began to model knowledge in terms of reliable information processing in the brain and in cognitive systems, a project that dovetails with work in cognitive science and information theory. An anecdote from the field captures the mood. A philosopher, a cognitive scientist, and a computer scientist walk into a seminar to compare notes on how a belief can track truth through noise. The question on the board is not what is knowledge, but what is the reliable causal pathway from truth to belief in a noisy world? The sense of collaboration across disciplines to answer causal questions about knowledge embodies the naturalized direction epistemology began to take at the end of the 20th century. Another historical vignette. When Plantinga introduced warrant and proper function, he gave a robust normative frame for cognitive reliability that was both theologically flavored and philosophically rigorous. The idea that cognitive faculties can be designed to produce true belief under normal conditions was transformative for analytic epistemology. It also opened a corridor to debates about how to assess reliability in non-ordinary environments, spaces of radical doubt, for instance, and how to anchor credibility in a way that can be tested and discussed across cultures, languages, and scientific disciplines. Plantinga's position helped to shift the debate from purely internal, justificational concerns to concerns about the design capacity of minds, a shift that ultimately fed into the larger conversation about how naturalized and experimental approaches could inform traditional epistemology. B. Safety and anti-luck proposals. SOSA, safety, and the anti-luck family. A second big family centers on what counts as safe from error. The idea is to constrain Gettier-type luck by requiring that a belief not be easily vulnerable to error in nearby possible worlds. Entitled in many circles as the safety framework, this approach is often associated with Ernest Sosa's development of safety talk and the broader anti-luck project in epistemology. The core claim is simple in form. A belief counts as knowledge only if it could not easily have been false in nearby possible worlds. The belief has a safety condition that constrains misalignment with truth. Sosa's program interlocks with a broader safety framework that aims to capture how rational belief should resist counterfactual errors. Two concrete examples illustrate how safety would handle Gettier-like cases and where it would constrain the luck that Gettier cases exploit. Example 1. The safe perception. Imagine someone sees a tree and forms the belief the tree is green. The belief is true. The perceptual process is generally reliable, and the belief would survive a nearby possible world variation in which the lighting conditions were slightly different. In those close worlds, the observer would still correctly see green. Under safety, this belief would pass the threshold of knowledge because in nearby worlds where the belief could easily have been false, the agent would not have formed the belief in the same way or would not be misled by the same perceptual conditions. The belief is safeguarded against a host of nearby world disruptions. In other words, it is safe. Example 2. The memory-based Gettier scenario reimagined through safety. Suppose a person remembers that a friend told them the time is 3 p.m. and forms the belief, it is 3 p.m. The memory is ordinarily reliable, and in nearby possible worlds, the person would still remember the same time from the same memory trace, unless a small variation disrupts the memory. But in a classic Gettier-like twist, the memory could be true for the wrong reason. The person's memory matches the actual time not because of their memory's reliability, but because the person's environment contained two independent cues that converge to yield the time showing 3 p.m. in different ways. The safety approach asks, would a small tweak in the environment cause the agent to form a false belief here? If the answer is yes, perhaps the memory belief fails safety. If no, it passes safety. Two counterarguments to safety. First, the circularity problem. How precisely do we draw the boundary of nearby possible worlds and rate safety without already having a theory of knowledge? If safety requires a fully specified modal field, we may be smuggling in our prior assumptions about what counts as epistemically safe, and the line can become too thick to be helpful in ordinary contexts. Second, the concern about overdemandingness. If safety is too stringent, it could exclude ordinary perceptual knowledge that we are inclined to accept in normal conditions. A pedestrian who looks out at a street and sees a red stop sign might be safe by many standards, but if there is a nearby world where the sign is hidden by fog or the observer's vision is temporarily occluded, some versions of safety would demand that such a perceptual belief be disqualified as knowledge even though we want to say it clearly is knowledge in practice. Two historical anecdotes for safety. The rise of anti-luck proposals in epistemology comes against the background of a broader critique of Gettier. Sosa's formulation of safety is often read as part of a broader shift toward robustness, knowledge as something that does not hinge on fragile, easily disruptible states. This movement sits alongside debates about how to handle memory and perception, where the reliability of cognitive processes must survive counterfactual scrutiny to count as knowledge. A second anecdote concerns the dialogue with virtue theory. In debates about safety, some philosophers bridge to virtue epistemology by asking whether safety conditions can be grounded in the character of intellectual agents, whether safe beliefs tend to be produced by virtuous dispositions, not merely by reliable mechanisms. This pairing invites a cross-pollination. Safety offers a formal constraint on luck. Virtue offers a normative account of why a knower would be reliable and careful in the first place. See proper function and virtue epistemology. Reliabilist versus virtuethical approaches. Here we move from the mechanism of reliability to the character of the knower. Proper function, as Plantinga develops it, asks whether the belief-forming process is functioning properly and designed to produce true beliefs in the environment in which it operates. Virtue epistemology, advanced prominently by Ernest Sosa and later Linda Zagzebski, redirects attention to intellectual virtues, dispositions like carefulness, intellectual courage, and open-mindedness. The reliabilist side emphasizes processes that tend to produce true beliefs in the long run. The virtue side emphasizes the epistemic character of agents who cultivate and deploy those processes under conditions of intellectual responsibility. Two concrete examples that reveal how this approach would treat Gettier cases. Example 1, the trained memory athlete. Imagine a scientist with not only a reliable memory, but cultivated intellectual virtues. Careful cross-checking, internal testing against alternative hypotheses, and a habit of seeking corroboration. In a Gettier-like case where the memory happens to lead to a true belief by luck, the virtuous knower would resist calling that knowledge unless the virtuous process has been at work in a way that reduces the chance of luck taking over. The emphasis is on the dispositions and practices that surround belief formation, verification, evidence gathering, and avoidance of cognitive shortcuts. If the agent's memory is reliable and their epistemic virtues were exerted in the process, the belief stands a better chance of counting as knowledge, even in cases that might otherwise look like luck. Example 2, the science journalist with intellectual virtue. A journalist writes a report about a scientific claim. The journalist's belief that the claim is true is supported by multiple independent sources, careful cross-checking, and a habit of seeking falsifying evidence. Suppose a Gettier-like twist arises. The journalist's conclusion happens to be true because of a rare alignment of independent factors. The virtue epistemology approach would insist that knowledge requires that the agent's cognitive character and the relevant virtues guide the inquiry in ways that avoid reliance on lucky coincidences. If the virtuous journalist would have found the same conclusion even when faced with counter-evidence, or would have rejected the belief if alternative explanations had been given, the belief could count as knowledge, otherwise not. Two counterarguments to this line. First, the vagueness of virtue. What exactly counts as an intellectual virtue? Is open-mindedness a virtue in one community and a vice in another? If we base knowledge on virtues, we risk a slippery measure problem. The standard for virtue might be indeterminate or culturally contingent, making it hard to apply across contexts or cultures. This is especially acute for cross-cultural memory, testimony, and scientific practice, where different epistemic communities value different virtues. Second, the compliance problem. A knower may display all the virtues, yet still stumble into Gettier-like luck if the environment aligns in an improbable way. The virtue approach faces the challenge of specifying a theory of knowledge that can tolerate such cases without surrendering the requirement that virtues provide stable, non-fortuitous grounds for belief. Two historical anecdotes for virtue. In the 1990s, Sosa's development of a virtue-theoretic account of knowledge drew attention to the virtue of intellectual virtue in the knower. Zagzebski, building on that groundwork, pressed the point that knowledge is inseparable from a system of intellectual virtues, virtues that are habituated dispositions rather than mere reliable processes. Their work reflects a broader shift toward asking how we cultivate reliable cognitive capacities through training, practice, and moral intellectual character. A second anecdote lands us in the broader conversation about the place of virtue in the theory of knowledge, showing how the virtue framework interacts with a more holistic view of scientific practice. Scientists not only seek true beliefs, but also cultivate the character and habits that sustain careful inquiry, even when rapid judgments might tempt them to cut corners under pressure. D. Contextualism and sensitivity to conversational context. Knowledge as a function of context contextualism is built on a simple, provocative claim. What counts as knowledge depends on the conversational context in which the knowledge ascription is made. In ordinary conversation, a speaker might be content with a lower standard, but in a skeptical context, or in a court of law, or in high-stakes scientific debate, the standards tighten. A shift in standard, not a shift in truth conditions, is what matters. The driving force here is not to disregard Gettier cases, but to explain why what seems to be knowledge in one setting might not be counted as knowledge in another. Two concrete examples illuminate contextualist thinking about Gettier cases. Example 1, the kitchen countertop knowledge. In ordinary conversation, you might say you know that there is coffee on the kitchen countertop. In a context where the standards are modest, your belief is counted as knowledge. But imagine the context is a high-stakes scientific debate about whether there is coffee present in a laboratory kitchen, where the experimenter demands extraordinary evidence before attributing knowledge. In that context, your knowledge attribution would require more justification, more rigor, and possibly evidence beyond a simple visual perception of coffee. The same mental state would get different verdicts depending on the conversational context. Example 2, the border control case. A traveler claims, "I know that the document is valid." In a casual, everyday setting, this might be a straightforward knowledge claim. In a security confrontation, however, the standard is far higher. If a tiny, counterfactual tweak in the context would have altered the justification or the standard of justification, the contextualist would say that the claim's status as knowledge changes accordingly. The Gettier problem in this frame becomes a matter of the epistemic standard shifting with context, rather than a single, context-free flaw in justification. two major counterarguments to contextualism. The first is a worry about the instability it entailed. If knowledge can shift with context, how can we have stable epistemic norms, public knowledge, and cross-context justification that science, law, and everyday life rely on? The second is a challenge to the practical utility of such a theory. If knowledge is so context-sensitive, how do we handle cross-context claims, such as testimony or scientific consensus, where knowledge claims traverse contexts that differ in standard? Critics worry that contextualism can devolve into a form of relativism, where truth conditions depend on what counts as knowledge in a given community, rather than on objective truth conditions. Proponents reply that the aim is to capture ordinary language use and epistemic practice in everyday contexts, and that the theory can preserve intersubjective norms by making explicit the context sensitivity of ascriptions. Two historical anecdotes here. Contextualism emerged most prominently in the late 1980s and early 1990s with Keith DeRose and his colleagues, who argued that the everyday use of no is sensitive to conversational context. That development marked a departure from the more rigid, context-insensitive models that dominated earlier epistemology. A second anecdote concerns the broader movement toward linguistic and semantic analysis in philosophy. Contextualism sits alongside discussions in philosophy of language about how content changes with context, and it illustrates how epistemology began to borrow tools from semantics to capture our intuitions about knowledge in ordinary speech, not just in idealized, abstract cases. Coherentist and anti-realist countermodels, the alternative seas of justification coherentism shifts the ground. Rather than requiring a linear chain from fact to justification, justification for a belief is provided by its place within a coherent system of beliefs. The Gettier problem presses hard on all theories that allow mere justification to be sufficient for knowledge. Coherentists respond by insisting that a true belief must cohere with a larger web of beliefs, and that the absence of coherence with a relevant set of background assumptions or the presence of a fallibilist, non-independent set of assumptions can undermine knowledge. Two concrete examples show how coherentist thinking would respond to Gettier-like twists. Example 1, the web of memory. A belief about a past event is justified by a memory that aligns with a web of background beliefs. The memory will be counted as knowledge only if it coheres with other memory traces, corroborating memories, and a consistent narrative across various sources. In Gettier-like twists, even a true belief formed by memory can fail knowledge if the memory lacks coherence with other independent beliefs about related events, or if a rival memory trace would fit equally well within the same web of beliefs. The emphasis is on the structure of justification. Is the belief embedded within a stable, coherent network? Example 2, the testimony case in science. A scientist believes a claim based on the testimony of multiple independent sources. The claim is true, but a single, deceptive chain exists that could have produced a different conclusion given slightly different background assumptions. A coherentist would insist that the researcher's belief counts as knowledge only if the entire network of beliefs, theory, data, background assumptions, and the independence of the sources is coherent and not threatened by alternative but equally coherent networks. The Gettier challenge becomes one of whether the belief is anchored in a robust, coherent structure with a safe position within the web. Two counterarguments for coherentism. First, the warm-up problem. How do you measure coherence? It's easy to claim that a system is coherent, but there are many ways to tell stories about the same data in ways that produce different but equally coherent systems. This raises a circular worry. Coherence is the criterion, so you can always define a world in which the system looks coherent. Thus, knowledge becomes too easy to manufacture or too hard to verify. Second, the problem of basing knowledge on a background theory that could itself be wrong. If the entire makeup of justification is a web and that web could be wrong, then how robust is knowledge? The theory can become self-referential and daunting to test against new evidence that requires revision of the entire network. Two historical anecdotes about coherentism. The rise of coherentist theories in the post-Gettier era parallels a broader movement away from a purely foundationalist picture of justification. Some of the most influential debates in the 1980s and 1990s, Bonjour's critique of foundationalism, for instance, pushed philosophers to look for justification in the structure of belief systems rather than in a tree of basic beliefs with strict, infallible foundations. The anti-realist strand of coherentism, pushed by some who hope to redefine justification as a matter of coherence within a community of epistemic agents, also mirrors broader philosophical currents that question absolute, context-independent frameworks in favor of intersubjective, pragmatic, or social dimensions of knowledge. Bayesian and probabilistic perspectives. A formal alternative to classical justification, a third big strand, which sometimes runs alongside others and sometimes in tension with them, is Bayesian epistemology. Here knowledge is reframed in probabilistic terms, degrees of belief, priors, likelihoods, and rational updating. The Bayesian frame invites a formal mechanism for tracking how evidence changes our confidence in propositions. One line of thought holds that knowledge is a high degree of posterior probability given the evidence, refined by proper Bayesian updating. The Gettier problem recasts itself as a question about whether a high posterior probability after a lucky update is enough to amount to knowledge, or whether additional, perhaps automatic, anti-luck constraints are required. Two concrete Bayesian-style examples to illustrate how this would play out. Example 1, the probabilistic memory. Suppose you have some memory of an event with a base rate of accuracy that places your posterior probability for the event at, say, 0.95 after reviewing the evidence. But there is a possibility of a confounding factor that sometimes yields a false memory with the same probability. Bayesian reasoning would say you should adjust your belief by incorporating independent sources of data. If those sources corroborate the memory, your posterior rises. If they contradict, you would revise downward. In a Gettier-like twist, where the memory lands true by coincidence but is not well supported by evidence, a Bayesian would insist that the posterior probability remains insufficient for knowledge unless the chain of evidence is strong and makes it highly unlikely that the belief would be true due to luck. Example 2, the scientific lab case. A scientist tests a claim with multiple, independent experiments. The data align and the posterior probability of the claim being true becomes very high. But a Gettier-like twist could propose that all the experiments share a hidden bias or a data processing error that conveniently aligns. A Bayesian approach would insist on robustness checks. If the bias is present in only some contexts, or if the model would yield similar results under different priors, then the posterior would not be as strong. The knowledge claim would rely on external validation and model scrutiny, not merely on the appearance of a high posterior probability in a given dataset. Two counterarguments to Bayesian epistemology. First, the problem of priors. In Bayesian reasoning, the choice of prior can dramatically influence the posterior, which raises concerns about subjectivity and arbitrariness. How do you justify your priors in a way that is not itself circular or biased? Second, the issue of practical implementation. In real-world epistemology, telling people to compute exact Bayesian updates about every belief is often impractical. The computational complexity and the cognitive demands of coherent Bayesian updating can be daunting, especially when time is limited or when information is noisy and conflicting. Two historical anecdotes about Bayesian epistemology. One comment on the philosophical climate. Bayesian methods gained traction in epistemology as a formal alternative to certainty-based justification, paralleling the rise of decision theory and probability in the social sciences. The second anecdote concerns the cross-pollination between statistics and philosophy, as Bayesian reasoning informs how to model degrees of belief with an explicit probabilistic structure, encouraging an interdisciplinary dialogue that favors formal clarity and empirical validation. This cross-disciplinary energy dovetails nicely with the naturalized turn in epistemology, where philosophers increasingly take cues from cognitive science, neuroscience, and statistics to ground theoretical claims about knowledge. Cross-references and connections. Naturalized epistemology and experimental philosophy throughout this landscape, the perennial push and pull between traditional epistemology and naturalized epistemology has been a guiding current. Naturalized epistemology invites us to ground the questions about knowledge in the sciences of mind and brain, to test hypotheses with empirical data about how people actually form beliefs, how they justify them, and what conditions produce reliable knowledge in practice. Experimental philosophy, often abbreviated as XPhi, pushes deeper into the empirical trenches by asking ordinary people to assess Gettier-like cases or to rate the strength of different epistemic positions, sometimes in controlled experimental setups. The results can support, challenge, or complicate theoretical claims, sometimes aligning with our intuitions and other times revealing systematic biases that philosophers must account for when theorizing about knowledge. The dialogue between the theoretical and the empirical, between a tidy formalism and the messy, real-world mind, has shaped the contemporary epistemological landscape in lasting ways. Historical note and anecdote. A turning point in the pluralism of epistemology occurred in the late 20th century as the field moved from a single, monolithic theory of knowledge to a pluralist, hybrid, and cross-disciplinary terrain. The Gettier problem itself became a spur for pluralism. A single remedy could not capture the complexity of epistemic success in diverse domains: perception, memory, testimony, science, and everyday belief. The rise of naturalized epistemology, the growth of experimental philosophy, and the bridging of the gap between cognitive science and epistemology all contributed to a landscape in which multiple theories compete, hybridize, and coexist. A second anecdote: the crucible of memory, testimony, and science. As memory research, social psychology, and cognitive science produced insights about how human agents maintain and revise beliefs, the very notions of justification and reliability were reframed in ways that made it possible to recast old debates in new empirical terms. The Gettier-inspired program, thus, did not end with a single answer. It sparked a field with a healthy respect for cross-disciplinary insight and a willingness to embrace complexity, nuance, and methodological pluralism. Single unifying question: not here. The contemporary epistemology of Gettier is not a monolith. It is a map with several roads, each road passing through different terrains of justification, reliability, virtue, context, and prediction. The landscape invites a kind of epistemic conversation in which we ask different questions at different times, depending on the domain: science, memory, testimony, everyday beliefs, and the kinds of knowledge that matter in a high-stakes context. Now, how do these theories intersect with real-world understanding, what they predict about science, memory, testimony, and everyday belief? Science. In the sciences, knowledge is often defended by independent lines of evidence, replicable experiments, and robust causal networks. The causal theory resonates with that method. Claims are accepted as knowledge when the causal pathways from the facts to the beliefs are robust and resistant to interference. The safety framework aligns with the practice of demanding safeguards against error, such as preregistration, replication, blinding, and the use of independent datasets. Contextualism can illuminate why scientific knowledge claims endure across contexts of debate, as long as the core standards of justification remain stable within scientific communities, even if public discourse varies in its normative demands. Bayesian perspectives have become particularly prominent in science because of their explicit probabilistic modeling of evidence and belief updating. They offer a natural way to quantify how much evidence is needed to move from belief to belief with high confidence, which suits the iterative, cumulative nature of science. Memory is notoriously fallible, but it remains central to knowledge in everyday life and to historians, researchers, and jurists. The safety and proper function approaches are useful here because they address how memory can survive counter-evidence and how memory processes can be shaped by healthy cognitive function and virtuous intellectual dispositions. Bayesian reasoning helps memory by providing a formal way to adjust confidence as new information comes in, and to discount beliefs when new data conflict with the old. For memory, a Gettier-laden case might involve a memory that lands true by coincidence but is not well supported by independent evidence. The question becomes, does the memory's reliability, its function, and its coherence with other beliefs supply a robust, non-lucky basis for knowledge? This is precisely where the virtues of careful memory training, corroboration, and critical self-scrutiny become relevant. Testimony. Testing claims about knowledge in others, such as what someone heard from a colleague, is a major strand of epistemology. Safety and anti-luck approaches help in evaluating testimony by asking how easily a testified belief could have gone wrong in nearby worlds, given the context of testimony, publication standards, and the possibility of deception. Contextualism helps explain why we accept testimony differently in different social or professional settings. A scientist's testimony in a lab carries different epistemic weight than a casual remark in a social setting, even when the content is the same. Bayesian approaches are natural here as well, modeling how trust in testimony updates our beliefs in light of prior probabilities and the reliability of the speaker. Everyday belief. The Gettier problem often feels remote when we are describing the shapes of trees and the color of the sky. But the cumulative effect of the various theories is to push us toward more careful, reflective practice in daily life. Cultivate intellectual virtues, check your memory against independent corroboration, be sensitive to context in ascribing knowledge to others, and take seriously that you could be misled if your cognitive processes rely on fragile or biased scaffolding. The practical upshot is not to surrender to skepticism, but to adopt methods and dispositions that reduce the likelihood of error across a broad range of ordinary and extraordinary contexts. In closing, a few cross-cutting reflections and provocations. The Gettier problem has not only survived but thrived by inviting a family of responses: causal, safety, proper function, and virtue, contextualist, coherentist, and Bayesian, each offering a distinct lens on what knowledge is, and each revealing its own strengths and weaknesses. The strength of a plural landscape is not to deny that some accounts are better than others in certain domains, but to recognize that knowledge is, in practice, a multifaceted phenomenon. The Gettier problem helps us see that knowing is not a blind, one-note state. It requires a robust interaction between truth, belief, justification, and the background conditions under which belief is formed and sustained. Cross-references to other debates and thinkers. The causal approach echoes the information-theoretic and teleological dimensions in the work of Dretske and Plantinga. The safety approach is a development in the anti-luck tradition that connects with Nozick's tracking theory and with broader concerns about anti-skeptical strategies. Virtue epistemology draws a bright line to moral psychology and the cultivation of character, linking epistemic success to the virtues of agents. Contextualism aligns with a long tradition in the philosophy of language and semantics that connects truth-conditional content to context and use. Coherentism and anti-realist models remind us that justification might be a system-wide property rather than a linear chain. Bayesian theories, with their degrees of belief and formal updating, connect epistemology to rational choice, statistics, and cognitive science, offering a precise way to quantify the impact of evidence. These are not isolated camps. Many contemporary theorists blend elements from multiple approaches, building hybrid theories that aim to capture the best of each. The naturalized turn and the experimental turn. The rise of naturalized epistemology encourages us to ground these debates in science, to examine how human cognition produces knowledge in real laboratories, on real memory tasks, in the social sciences, and in the wilds of everyday life. The experimental turn asks, what do ordinary people's intuitions actually reveal about knowledge across contexts? Do these intuitions align with the best theoretical models, or do they mislead us in systematic ways? The cross-fertilization is not merely methodological. It shapes what counts as evidence, how we test theories, and how we interpret the results. The Gettier-induced pluralism is, in part, a historical marker of how epistemology responded to a crisis in which no single recipe could salvage knowledge as a simple, straightforward notion. Quotes from primary sources to anchor the dialogue, paraphrases in context. As Gettier himself asked, is justified true belief knowledge? The famous title asks a precise question about the sufficiency of JTB for knowledge, not a rhetorical flourish, and the paper's core shows that there can be belief that is justified, true, and held by the subject, yet not knowledge. The Gettier-style insight invites a rethinking of justification as enough for knowledge. Perhaps we need something more, something that recognizes the role of robustness, safety, and causal connection. On the causal side, we encounter Dretske's insistence that information is the currency of knowledge, and Plantinga's call for warrant based on proper function. A belief can be true and justified, yet lacking warrant if the cognitive faculties that produce the belief fail under normal conditions or are miscoordinated with reality. On the virtue side, Zagzebski emphasizes that virtue is a key to knowledge. Intellectual virtues contribute to reliable belief formation. In this spirit, Sosa's framework treats knowledge as a deliverance of a mind that performs well under the conditions of practice, a confidence that flows from successful track record rather than a single isolated event. Contextualist voices remind us that the same sentence, "I know this," can be true or false depending on the conversational framework and the demands of the moment. Coherentists remind us that justification matters in the company of other beliefs. Bayesian theorists insist on the power of evidence to recalibrate beliefs with mathematical precision. These are not mere footnotes. They are living ideas that shape how scientists, memory researchers, jurists, teachers, and laypeople think about knowing in their daily lives. The overarching aim for the audience. The goal of this segment is not simply to catalog theories, but to offer you a sense of how a modern epistemologist would approach a Gettier-like problem in a variety of domains. The map helps you see which theory you could apply to a given context: science, memory, testimony, or ordinary perception. It invites you to imagine your own Gettier twist and to ask how a causal, safety-based, virtue-ethical, contextualist, coherentist, or Bayesian framework would handle it. The point is not that one theory wins, but that a rich, plural toolkit equips us to understand knowledge in a world where truth is often not magically aligned with our beliefs, where luck can masquerade as certainty, and where the engine behind knowing runs through the currents of methods, dispositions, contexts, and probabilities. To close, I'll leave you with a few prompts to carry into your own reflections and perhaps into your own writing or discussion groups. In your own Gettier-like scenario, which aspect of the case most unsettles you? The causal relation, the safety against error, the virtue, or lack thereof of the agent, the conversational context, the coherence of the belief system, or the probabilistic structure that underwrites belief? Which approach do you find most compelling for explaining knowledge in science, memory, or testimony? Is it the robust causal connection of a properly functioning cognitive system, the anti-luck safety of beliefs, the virtuous character of knowers, the sensitivity of knowledge to context, the coherence of a network of beliefs, or the numerical discipline of Bayesian updating? Do you find a hybrid approach more persuasive, one that borrows strengths from several frameworks while acknowledging their weaknesses? If so, what would a hybrid look like in practice? How do naturalized epistemology and experimental philosophy shape your sense of what counts as evidence for knowledge? Do empirical results align with your intuitions, or do they pull you toward reformulating the theoretical terms? Finally, what would knowledge look like in a world that values science, memory, testimony, and ordinary perception equally? If we sought a unifying account that could accommodate all domains, what elements would you insist must be present, and which could be relaxed in light of domain-specific demands? As you step back from this landscape in these many cases, you'll notice a basic coherence. Knowledge remains a robust, complex achievement that cannot be reduced to a single trigger, no single test, no single rule, no single domain. It is, in every sense, a collaborative product of the world, the mind, the social environment, and the tools we bring to bear on evidence. The Gettier problem did not end by stamping out luck with a single solution. It prompted a pluralistic ecosystem of theories that each address a different facet of the problem. The challenge now is to think clearly, to test our theories against the best possible Gettier-like cases in science, memory, and testimony, and to remain attentive to the empirical humanities and the social sciences that shape how we know what we know. In the Snooze philosophy tradition, we invite you to sit with these tensions, to notice the subtle ways in which truth and justification bend under pressure, and to acknowledge that in the end, knowledge may be less a fixed possession than a disciplined practice, one that we continually revise as we learn more about ourselves, about others, and about the world we inhabit together. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're watching a speedometer climb toward a green signal. A moment of certainty arrives, but not quite with the calm confidence you expected. It's not that you suddenly know nothing. Rather, you find yourself in a space where belief feels earned, and yet the ground beneath that belief looks a little slippery. This is the bridge between theory and practice that we're stepping onto in this segment. How the Gettier issue, this stubborn little knot in epistemology, reaches beyond the philosophical whiteboard and into the messy, high-stakes world of science, education, online information, and the choices we make with artificial intelligence. If knowledge is not merely justified true belief, then what counts as knowing in a world full of imperfect evidence, noisy data, and clever but fallible machines? And how should we teach, evaluate, and trust knowledge claims when the air itself seems to bend under luck's hand? Let us begin with the origins and the arc that leads us to today. The Gettier problem arrives in the middle of a conversation that has been going on for millennia. What exactly is knowledge, and what distinguishes a true belief that sits on a solid foundation from one that merely appears to be knowledge because it happens to be true at the moment? The classic triptych justified, true, believed appears clean and tidy, almost too tidy for the messy human world. It promises a neat logic. You have a belief, you have justification for that belief, and the belief happens to be true. So by that account, you know it. But then along comes Gettier in 1963 with a wrench disguised as a story. He doesn't deny that justification matters. He doesn't dispute that the belief is true. What he does contest is the sufficiency of the combination, the idea that justification plus truth guarantees knowledge in the real, imperfect world. To grasp the core, consider an iconic, compact setup that has become a kind of epistemic fable in graduate seminars and late-night podcast talks alike. Smith has strong justification for believing that Jones will get the job. Smith also has strong justification for believing that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. From these two justified beliefs, Smith infers the claim that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in their pocket. What Smith doesn't realize is that the person who will get the job is not Jones, but Smith himself, and by some stroke of luck, Smith also has 10 coins in his own pocket. So Smith has a belief that is true, and his justification appears sound. Yet the truth of the proposition, the person who will get the job has 10 coins in their pocket, is achieved by luck, not by the solid, connecting reasons we normally want when we say someone knows something. The conclusion is not knowledge, Gettier argues, even though the conditions of justification and truth are present. If you hear that story and feel a twinge of recognition, you're not alone. It's not merely an arcane puzzle slipped into a philosophy journal, it's a mirror held up to real-world claims. In everyday life, we often feel that when a belief is justified and true, we know it. Yet Gettier's little stories suggest that the bridge from justification to knowledge may be more fragile than we thought. The problem isn't simply that we're mistaken about a fact. It's that the reason we're confident in a fact can turn out to be a matter of chance rather than a reliable anchor. The distinction between the belief's truth and the reasons we have for that belief is more delicate than the phrase justified true belief allows. Now let's widen the frame to see how this philosophical conundrum bites into the real world: science, education, online information, and artificial intelligence. We live in an age that celebrates knowledge as a social product, a product of evidence, argument, testing, and replication. Yet we also inhabit a world where data is abundant, methods are complex, and the chance of lucky hits is never far away. The Gettier problem presses us to ask not only what we know, but how we know it in the day-to-day processes that shape policy, pedagogy, media literacy, and algorithmic decisions. In science, the Gettier problem nudges us to examine scientific knowledge as more than a cluster of correct predictions or true claims that once had credible justification. It invites us to ask about the reliability of these justifications across alternative contexts, not merely in the laboratory where conditions are controlled. When a scientific claim is supported by a model or a correlation, say, a statistical association between two variables, the Gettier concern cautions us to ask: if the correlation is real, is the justification for believing in a causal mechanism robust across populations, across changing conditions, and across different data-generating processes? Or could the same true result have arisen as a fortunate byproduct of how the data were gathered, how the sample was selected, or how a particular model was tuned? In other words, Gettier invites humility about what counts as knowledge in scientific practice, when the practical justification for a claim might be contingent, local, or prone to lucky coherence. In education, Gettier prompts us to rethink what we should teach students to value when their ideas are tested, debated, and applied beyond the classroom walls. If knowledge is not simply justified true belief, then the curriculum must cultivate more than the mechanics of justification, more than memorized criteria, argumentative wins, or checklists of what counts as evidence. It must cultivate habits of critical checking, cross-context validation, and an awareness of the limits of our justification in real-world settings. The classroom becomes a laboratory for examining how belief meets evidence not only in the abstract, but under the pressures of time, social influence, and the consequences of action. It invites educators to foreground epistemic virtues, intellectual humility, cautious inference, openness to revision, so students learn to navigate when a justification once seemed robust but later seems inadequate once conditions shift. This isn't simply about teaching students to cite sources. It's about teaching them to test the robustness of their knowledge claims against new kinds of evidence and new contexts. Online information is perhaps the most palpable stage for Gettier's concerns in contemporary life. The internet hosts a vibrantly complex ecosystem of data, opinion, misinterpretation, and automation. We can have a claim that appears well justified by accessible sources, and yet be true in a way that rests on a lucky alignment of data and interpretation. The proliferation of fact checks, algorithmic recommendations, and AI-assisted content generation makes the Gettier problem not merely a philosophical curiosity, but a practical diagnostic tool. When we see a claim that seems true, we must ask how robust the justification is across sources, how the data were collected, what confounders were considered, and whether the apparent justification would hold under a shift of context or a different data-generating process. The danger is not only error, but the sense that we have knowledge when, in fact, our justification hinges on a local pattern that may collapse under scrutiny. The Gettier lens helps us resist the seductive certainty that data alone grant knowledge. It invites us to probe the mechanisms, the reliability, the cross-checking, and the safeguards that connect evidence to warranted belief. In artificial intelligence, Gettier-like pitfalls appear with a particular clarity because we can observe the mechanics of justification, the structure of inference, and the brittleness of trained models when confronted with data that differ from training. Two real-world classes of Gettier-like situations stand out: spurious correlations masquerading as knowledge, and memory-like fallibility in learning systems that produce true outputs for the wrong reasons. Let me give you two concrete, relatable, modern illustrations. First example, spurious correlations in AI decision-making. Imagine a machine learning system trained to predict student success based on a large dataset of student profiles and outcomes. The model discovers that a highly correlated feature, say, the number of late-night study sessions logged in the learning platform, predicts pass rates with impressive accuracy. It learns to justify its predictions by pointing to this feature and by showing other supportive correlations in the data. Then the system is deployed in a new school where cultural patterns shift. Students study at different times, or the platform logs a different set of behaviors because of a change in the interface. In the new context, the correlation between late-night sessions and success might be much weaker or non-existent. The model still outputs high-confidence predictions for many students, and some of those predictions are correct, again, by luck or because the new environment happens to echo the training environment in some superficial way. The belief formed by the model, this student will succeed based on this pattern, is justified within the training data, and it turns out to be true for a portion of cases, but the justification is fragile. The model's knowledge rests on a lucky alignment, not on a robust causal understanding that would generalize. The Gettier-style pitfall here is clear. True predictions arise, but the reasons for those predictions do not amount to knowledge because the justification fails under a shift of conditions. In science, this resembles a high-stakes claim that a treatment works for patients because a particular surrogate marker appeared in trial data, only to find that in broader practice, the surrogate does not reliably track real outcomes. In education, it mirrors a diagnostic claim that works in one district because of unique demographic interactions, but fails elsewhere because the justification depended on those specific interactions. Second example. Memory-like distortions and reliability in data interpretation. A medical team reviews patient records and believes certain symptoms predict a rare adverse event. Their justification rests on a retrospective correlation discovered in a dataset that happens to align with the event. They then act on that belief to screen patients differently, and in a new dataset, the correlation either weakens or reverses. The event happens to occur for patients who match the previous pattern, so the team's action yields a correct outcome in some cases. But the knowledge claim, the predictive rule, was not robustly justified across contexts. It was true in the sense of one dataset's luck, but not knowledge in the epistemic sense. Here the Gettier lesson lands squarely in data interpretation and medical decision-making. Precision and accuracy can coexist with epistemic fragility if the underlying justification relies on luck or on a fragile pattern that doesn't generalize. Two additional real-world illustrations further illuminate the terrain. Consider the broader information ecosystem online. The claim that watching this video will improve your critical thinking might be supported by a sequence of testimonials and studies. Yet the justification for such a claim depends on self-selection biases, publication bias, and the complexities of transfer to diverse audiences. The claim could be true for certain viewers under certain conditions, but that truism would not amount to universal knowledge about education or epistemic improvement. Or think about the interpretability problem in AI. A model might explain its decisions with a justification that looks rational to a human observer, presenting a narrative that sounds like reasoning. But if the justification is a curated story rather than a true causal mechanism, the model's success could be as much luck as grounded understanding. This is a modern Gettier landscape in which truth and justification align in some cases, but the alignment is not robust or transferable. To navigate these waters, we turn to multiple lines of response drawn from cognitive science, Bayesian reasoning, and data ethics. In cognitive science, we see that human justification is often constructed under constraint. Memory, perception, and social cues shape what counts as evidence. Memory, for instance, is famously fallible and reconstructive. We may be justified in remembering a fact because we recall it clearly and repeatedly, yet our memory can be distorted by subtle suggestion, bias, or the mere passage of time. In Gettier terms, our justification is not a guaranteed road to knowledge because the memory trace that supports the belief can be erroneous, or the truth supported by memory can depend on confounding factors we have not adequately controlled. This is not a trivial point about human frailty. It is a reminder that justification is not guaranteed to generalize beyond the conditions that made it persuasive in the first place. Bayesian reasoning offers a complementary lens. In Bayesian epistemology, knowledge is often modeled as a state of high probability given evidence, updated as new data arrive. The Gettier problem, however, invites a caveat. High posterior probability does not automatically translate into knowledge if the justification is sensitive to the structure of the model or the data-generating process. In practice, you might have a belief with a high posterior probability because the model has learned a strong pattern in the current data, yet a shift in context, different data distribution, different confounders, or an adversarial manipulation could dramatically alter the likelihood that the belief remains true and justified. The Gettier challenge, then, is not only about how to justify a belief, but how to ensure that the justification remains robust when the world changes. Bayesian reasoning pushes us toward continuous testing, robustness checks, and sensitivity analyses that reveal how dependent our knowledge claims are on specific assumptions, priors, and data-generating mechanisms. Data ethics also enters this conversation in a crucial way. The Gettier problem is a prime invitation to examine the ethics of belief in an era of algorithmic decision-making, surveillance, and automated risk assessment. If we deploy models that produce true outputs in some contexts but for reasons that are opaque or brittle, we risk exporting epistemic fragility into real-world harms. Misdiagnoses, biased lending, unjust surveillance, or unfair policy decisions that look justified because they happen to work on limited data, yet fail with broader evidence. Here the ethical stakes are explicit. If a decision is justified and true only by luck, is it acceptable to rely on it in a life-affecting domain? The answer often depends on the safeguards we design: transparent validation, explicit uncertainty quantification, human-in-the-loop oversight, and a culture of praise for robust justification over confident luck. As we travel deeper, we encounter two primary arguments that scholars offer as responses to Gettier. The first is a philosophical critique. Maybe the problem is not that knowledge is a rare species, but that the classic JTB framework is mistaken for a theory of knowledge in the first place. Put differently, the Gettier problem may reveal that the fundamental aim of epistemology is not to carve out a stricter, more cutting definition of knowledge, but to articulate the precise conditions under which our beliefs are not merely justified and true, but reliably formed through reliable processes: safety, continuity across contexts, and a protective invariance against luck. Some philosophers propose add-on conditions that must accompany justified true belief, things like being formed by a reliable cognitive process, having been produced by safety-conscious methods, or avoiding reliance on unjustified lemmas or accidental truths. Others propose a causal theory of knowledge, where knowledge requires a causal connection between belief and the truth that goes beyond mere internal justification. The rough idea is to look not only at the correctness of a belief, but at the reliability of the pathway by which that belief came to be. The second approach is pragmatic or contextual. This line of thought argues that in the ordinary, everyday purposes of life, the classical Gettier worries may not be the most urgent concern. If a belief is sufficiently reliable for the purposes at hand, then perhaps we do not always need to demand the extra burden of philosophical certainty. Pragmatic knowledge would privilege acts and dispositions that reliably guide action and ensure successful outcomes in context, even if, in principle, the deepest theoretical condition for knowledge remains unsettled. You can hear echoes of this in educational practice, where teachers emphasize not only the truth of a claim, but its applicability, resilience, and usefulness in real situations. Or in science communication, where the emphasis is often on what can be demonstrated, replicated, and explained in accessible terms to a broad audience, rather than on satisfying abstract criteria for knowledge in a laboratory sense. Let me pause to offer two historical anecdotes that illuminate how epistemology intersected with major intellectual shifts and technological revolutions. The first is a window into the information theory revolution that recast knowledge as something that can be measured, transmitted, and secured. In the mid-20th century, the field of information theory, crystallized by Claude Shannon, revealed how information flows, how messages become reliable in the face of noise, and how systems can be designed to minimize uncertainty. This shift from a preoccupation with the content of belief to concerns about signal fidelity and error correction transformed not only engineering but epistemology itself. When knowledge claims are mediated by channels, codes, and transmissions, the question becomes: how robust is the justification of a claim when faced with uncertainty, distortion, or manipulation of information? Shannon's mathematics offered a way to quantify uncertainty and to ask whether a signal is preserved with enough integrity to justify a belief about the world. In this sense, the Gettier problem meets information theory by demanding that our epistemic claims be anchored not just in internal justification, but in robust, verifiable pathways that survive the noise of real communication. The second anecdote peels back the layers of the data revolution and the debates around AI reliability. In the 1960s through the 1980s, the early AI era produced systems that could perform impressive tasks, but their reliability in real-world settings exposed persistent epistemic fragility. As data grew more abundant and computation more accessible, we invited algorithms into critical decisions, from medicine to finance to law enforcement. The Mars Climate Orbiter disaster in 1999 became a widely cited cautionary tale about the consequences of relying on incorrect units and mismatched assumptions in a complex system. It was a failure of translation and a failure of interlocking justification across teams, a vivid demonstration that even when a plan looks coherent in isolation, joint systems can fail to carry knowledge forward into action. This anecdote embodies the Gettier intuition at scale. A true outcome can emerge from a chain of decisions that are in themselves justified, yet the overall chain fails to guarantee knowledge when the systemic context shifts or when critical links are misaligned. If we bring these threads together, Gettier-informed theories begin to alter how we teach, evaluate, and trust knowledge claims in modern life. In education, this translates into pedagogical practices that emphasize epistemic humility and resilience. It's not enough to teach students to memorize facts and to recite the steps of a proof. We want them to learn how to test their beliefs across contexts, how to distinguish luck from robustness, and how to identify when a justification may be predisposed to failure under new evidence or different data. We would invite students to practice cross-checking claims against alternative data sources, to examine the causal structure of explanations, and to recognize when a line of reasoning becomes dangerously dependent on a single, fragile pattern. In science, researchers would be encouraged to study not only the truth of a claim, but the stability of the justification under replications, different populations, and changing conditions. Replication is not only a methodological courtesy, it is a hedge against Gettier-like luck. In science communication, the emphasis shifts toward transparency about uncertainty, the provenance of data, and the conditional nature of claims. The public sphere becomes a training ground for epistemic vigilance, not a battlefield for a false sense of certainty. In online information ecosystems, Gettier thinking invites us to design interfaces and platforms that foreground epistemic hygiene. It would be prudent to present multiple lines of supporting evidence, highlight where data might be sensitive to context shifts, and encourage critical appraisal of the grounds of justification, not merely the truth of the conclusion. Truth in this sense becomes a matter of sustained reliability across contexts, rather than a once-for-all verdict. In the design of AI systems, it invites stronger commitments to reliability, explainability, and safety. If a model's outputs are true only because of lucky correlations or contingent data artifacts, that model's claims do not deserve the same epistemic weight as those grounded in robust causal structures and tested in diverse conditions. This is not a call to abandon predictive power, but a call to align predictive power with robust justification, to separate the signal from the noise, and to build systems that are not only accurate in narrow circumstances, but resilient when the world surprises us. Now let's turn to two counterarguments more explicitly, as they help illuminate the pragmatic edges of the Gettier problem. First, the claim that the problem may be less about practical knowledge and more about the philosophical ideal of knowledge. If knowledge is a high ideal, a gold standard, then the fact that Gettier shows there can be justified true belief without knowledge might be more about the ideal than about everyday cognition. In other words, perhaps the ordinary functioning of human knowledge, what we rely on in daily life, what scientists rely on in routine contexts, what educators rely on in classrooms, often operates sufficiently well with a safety margin that is not captured by an ultra-strict philosophical criterion. People do not constantly track every possible counterexample or failure mode. They operate with heuristics, reliability estimates, and pragmatic tolerances. The Gettier problem then becomes a tool for sharpening our awareness of edge cases, rather than a wholesale indictment of everyday knowledge. The practical upshot might be: we don't need to eliminate all Gettier scenarios to have a workable, trustworthy epistemic culture. We need to build systems that can recognize when a justification is fragile and trigger checks, warnings, or human oversight. Second, pragmatic or contextual approaches may be sufficient for most everyday purposes, even if the pure theory remains unsettled. This is not an argument for anything goes or for abandoning rigorous standards. Rather, it's an argument for recognizing that in many practical domains, education, policy, medicine, journalism, we judge claims by their ability to guide action effectively in the relevant context, by their resilience under routine scrutiny, and by their track record across a set of critical tests. If a claim continues to work after repeated, varied challenges, many would say it is knowledge in practice, even if there remains a philosophical nagging doubt about whether every Gettier-like counterexample has been resolved. The risk of over-idealizing knowledge is that we lose the sense of epistemic humility that Gettier invites. The risk of underappreciating Gettier is that we cling to a naive confidence that all true beliefs justified by evidence are knowledge, and we risk paying the price when one of those Gettier moments collapses in crucial situations. The balance perhaps lies in cultivating systems, education, science, AI ethics that reward robust justification, while acknowledging that none of us can guarantee that every justified true belief is, in the end, knowledge. Let me weave in another strand that makes this conversation richer: cross-references to ordinary knowledge in education, science communication, and the ethics of belief. In education, the Gettier lens nudges us toward teaching epistemic literacy as a core competence. Students learn to distinguish justification, that is context-dependent, from justification, that claims to be robust across contexts. They practice evaluating sources, examining data provenance, and testing claims against counterexamples. In science communication, Gettier considerations underscore why communicating uncertainty is not a liability but a responsibility. A claim presented with caveats, confidence intervals, and explicit limitations can be more epistemically honest than a bold, overconfident proclamation that later collapses under scrutiny. In the ethics of belief, Gettier prompts reflection on the social consequences of our epistemic choices. The propagation of justified but potentially fragile beliefs can lead to misinformed policies, biased decisions, or unfair outcomes if not met with circumspection and accountability. To anchor this more concretely, let me offer two more real-world reflections that widen the perspective beyond abstract theory. First, the rise of data governance and ethics frameworks in corporate and public sectors is, in part, a response to Gettier-like concerns about knowledge claims derived from data. Organizations now grapple with issues of data provenance, auditability, and model accountability to ensure that decisions that affect people's lives rest on more than statistically true statements in limited contexts. They require evidence that is robust across populations, that can be explained in human terms, and that remains credible under scrutiny from independent auditors and the public. The aspiration is not to stamp out uncertainty, but to ensure that the justification survives the broader test of fairness, transparency, and accountability. The second reflection concerns the role of memory and cognitive biases in how we form and defend knowledge claims in daily life. The Gettier problem echoes in the way we palate our beliefs. Memory confidence, persuasive anecdotes, and social reinforcement can create a sense of justified truth that is not as robust as we would like. Recognizing these dynamics can make us more careful in forming beliefs, more transparent about the reasons for them, and more open to reevaluating when new data arrive. If we pause to return to the question of why Gettier matters, the answer has depth and texture. It's not merely a puzzle for philosophers to debate in seminar rooms, nor a sterile exercise in analytic rigor. It's a guide to ethical, practical living in a world where knowledge claims compete for our trust, our resources, and the futures of others. It invites us to reformulate what counts as knowledge in public life, to elevate not only truth and justification but reliability across contexts, resilience to shifts in data, and a sensitivity to the social and ethical dimensions of belief. It challenges us to design education, science, media, and AI systems that are not dazzled by a single correct outcome, but tempered by a consistent insistence on robust, explicable, and transferable justification. In short, it invites epistemology to walk with practice rather than behind it. To crystallize the synthesis, consider this closing meditation on a few lines of primary voice that connect the ancient search for certainty with modern questions about trust, evidence, and responsibility. The ancient storehouse of thought offers a compact voice that still resonates. All men by nature desire to know. The impulse to know is universal, but the route from desire to knowledge is fraught with uncertainty, misdirection, and luck. The bridge from belief to knowledge must be built not only with the mortar of justification, but with the keystone of reliability that holds under the test of new evidence in changing circumstances. And as Socrates is reported to have said through the voice of Plato, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. That line is not a rejection of knowledge. It is a warning about certainty that does not honor the real fragility of the justification that undergirds our beliefs. It is a call to pursue knowledge with an openness to revision, to entertain doubt as a companion rather than a foe, and to remain vigilant in the face of the alluring ease of a seemingly true belief that turned out to be luck. In that spirit, here are two memorable, compact quotes from primary sources that can anchor our reflections as you listen to and think through these ideas. Cogito, ergo sum. Descartes reminds us that certainty without the right ground is dangerous, and the famous line is a safeguard against mistaking the appearance of certainty for certainty itself. It invites us to examine what counts as the ground of our beliefs and to question whether that ground could survive scrutiny in the face of challenges and alternative possibilities. All men by nature desire to know. Aristotle's opening move in metaphysics is a reminder that knowledge sits at the heart of human aspiration, but the Gettier shift asks us to scrutinize not the impulse to know, but the architecture of justification that follows from it. The desire is universal. The method must be rigorous, robust, and attentive to the possibility that what looks true today may be luck tomorrow. The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. Socrates speaks through the tradition that outlived him, the humility to see epistemic boundaries. This motto, taken across centuries, is not a surrender but a disciplined stance toward inquiry. It asks us to keep testing, refining, and reevaluating our beliefs in light of new evidence and new ways of seeing the same facts. As a closing note for this section, this bridge between theory and practice, let me return to the perennial question of how Gettier changes the way we teach, evaluate, and trust knowledge claims in modern life. The Gettier problem is not just a clever puzzle about whether belief plus justification is enough to count as knowledge. It's a summons to pay closer attention to the mechanisms that generate justification, the stability of those grounds under conditions of novelty and stress, and the ethical consequences of our epistemic choices. In education, this means cultivating epistemic reflexivity, training students to question the grounds of their beliefs, to examine data provenance, to test claims against diverse contexts, and to understand how cognitive biases, social dynamics, and methodological choices shape what counts as justified truth. In science, it means designing experiments, models, and explanations that emphasize robustness, replication, and the causal structure of knowledge claims, so that our justification is not a temporary artifact but a durable scaffold. In AI and data ethics, it means building systems that do more than perform well on average. They must be explainable, verifiable, and safe across contexts, with clear boundaries and ongoing evaluation. In public discourse, Gettier invites humility about certainty and generosity toward criticism, recognizing that what seems true today might be vulnerable to tomorrow's evidence. In short, a Gettier-informed epistemology is not a surrender to skepticism or a retreat into relativism. It is a disciplined practice that invites continuous testing, transparent justification, and steadfast humility in the face of uncertainty. If you felt the tug of that invitation in your own life, you're recognizing a living tradition, one that is as much about how we live with knowledge as it is about what we claim to know. The Gettier problem is not a quiet corner of philosophy. It is a prompt for a more careful, more ethical, more robust relation to truth in the 21st century. It asks us to examine the pathways by which we arrive at beliefs, to demand fidelity from those pathways under the pressures of real-world use, and to cultivate a culture where uncertainty is visible, where evidence is scrutinized across contexts, and where knowledge in the deepest sense is a product of method, trust, and responsibility, not luck.